sat on the throne, lost in thought. The room was dark, but a ray of light illuminated him, almost like he was the only thing that mattered. Meanwhile, the man was grinning like a maniac, even with all the blood covering his face. He looked absolutely thrilled. The man in the armor stood over the bodies of his enemies, a sinister aura surrounding him. The attacker spoke, boasting that it was pretty warm and cozy, and that he had put a lot of money into making that trap. The figure stood tall, an axe in his hand, with a blazing fire behind him. The attacker seemed unfazed by the heat, like he was born in the flames. The attacker stared intensely, his eyes piercing through the helmet. He asked if the other person liked it, clearly proud of the trap he had set. The wounded man, covered in blood, couldn't believe what he was hearing. He stammered, asking if Ghislaine was the garbage he thought he was. He wanted to know if Ghislaine had known his plans all along. Far below, Ghislaine stood silent over the bodies. Ghislaine continued, explaining that he also knew how many of them there were, who the spies were, and who had helped them with reinforcements. He knew everything, it seemed. Ghislaine declared that he had known it all from the start. He said that there was no way they could win, because he'd always been a hidden ace card. The wounded man screamed, asking how Ghislaine could dare to do this. He was furious that someone he considered an useless piece of trash would even think about doing this to him. Ghislaine's axe was already falling. Ghislaine told him to shut it. The axe had already fallen, and the man's life was over. Ghislaine's helmet fell to the ground as he declared that they could try invading as many times as they wanted. He vowed that he was going to win the war every single time. Ghislaine smiled, knowing he had already won. He asked if they knew why he was so confident, and then he explained that it was because he had all the plans. A year before, near the Perdiem estate in the Luthania kingdom, tents were set up. It was a time before the fall, before everything changed. Suddenly, Ghislaine was lying in a bed, gasping for air. He was completely disoriented and asked himself what had just happened. Ghislaine sat up, clutching his chest in disbelief. He couldn't understand how he was still alive, and he asked himself if it was real. Ghislaine's eyes widened, his face contorted in disbelief. He started to say that just a moment ago, the sword dropped from his grasp, clattering against the ground. It was over before he even realized it. Blood splattered across Ghislaine's face as he realized what had happened. He just muttered, "Shoot." Ghislaine was bleeding out on the battlefield. He thought to himself that this was how it was going to end for Ghislaine Perdiem, the mercenary king, one of the continent's 7 strongest men. The war was over, and Eden, one of the continent's top 7 noble knights, stood over him with a smile. He had won. The enemy stood over Ghislaine, sword raised high, ready to strike. Ghislaine, lying in the dirt, could only think it was a shame he wasn't able to get his revenge. The enemy sneered down at Ghislaine, calling him a sickening bastard. He spat out the words, "Mercenary King Ghislaine Perdiem," like they were nothing but garbage. The enemy admitted he hadn't expected Ghislaine to be the oldest son of the fallen Perdiem household. He asked how Ghislaine knew all this, considering he was from a different kingdom. The enemy scoffed, saying that of course he knew. He admitted he'd worked his tail off a long time ago trying to track Ghislaine down. The enemy grinned, revealing that they were the ones who worked with the Delphine household to bring down Ghislaine's family. He looked absolutely proud of it. Ghislaine looked up in shock, blood dripping down his face. He demanded to know if there were other people involved besides Duke Delphine's household. The enemy stood over Ghislaine, looking down at him with a cold stare. He said there was no point in explaining anything since Ghislaine was about to die anyway, and told him to just accept his fate. Ghislaine looked absolutely furious, his face covered in blood and dirt. He shouted that he would never forgive the enemy for what he'd done. The enemy raised his sword high above his head, the blade glinting in the light. He was ready to end Ghislaine's life. Right there. He remembered the sword coming down, how he was fallen in that moment, but somehow he was back in his younger body, sitting in a tub with his head still on his shoulders. Ghislaine looked around, completely lost. He wondered if what he'd experienced was just a hallucination, and realized he was back in his younger body. Ghislaine wondered if he had been captured and used as a lab rat by mages. He looked absolutely furious, promising to make those arrogant jerks regret having kept him alive. Just then, someone called out to him, calling him young master. Ricardo, a soldier of the Perdiem family, called out, asking the young master to come out. He knew that Ghislaine was awake. Ricardo suddenly held a finger to his lips, telling someone to be quiet. He looked serious. His eyes narrowed. Ricardo held his sword up to Ghislaine's neck, telling him that he'd let him live if he answered his questions. Or maybe not, he thought. Ricardo looked down at Ghislaine, holding the sword closer to his neck. Ricardo asked if Ghislaine thought he was crossing the line, since a no was a no. Ricardo was clearly confused by Ghislaine's calm reaction. Ricardo was starting to panic. He was confused as hell by Ghislaine's reaction. He wondered why Ghislaine was so calm when he was being threatened with a sword. Ricardo suddenly punched Ghislaine in the face. Ghislaine stumbled back, completely shocked. Ricardo explained that Ghislaine had tired himself out from his tantrum earlier and fell asleep. Ghislaine was even more confused, wondering if he really did that. Ricardo looked down at Ghislaine, whose face was a mask of confusion. Ricardo said that Ghislaine had been throwing a tantrum about how he was going to command the group to raid the orcs. Ghislaine was still trying to process what Ricardo was saying. Ghislaine was getting annoyed, calling the whole thing nonsense. Ricardo told him to get his stuff together because people were waiting. Ghislaine was still lost, wondering where they were even going. Ricardo told Ghislaine that they were going to the Perdium estate, of course. Ghislaine didn't seem to understand what was going on, but Ricardo didn't seem to care. Ghislaine was completely lost. He just stared ahead, mouth open, trying to process what Ricardo had just said. Ghislaine asked Ricardo to repeat himself, shocked by what he had just heard. Ricardo was getting annoyed, asking if Ghislaine was sorry for throwing a tantrum earlier. Finally, they arrived. Ghislaine stood on a small hill, staring down at the Perdium estate in the distance. Ghislaine was absolutely floored. He couldn't believe that it really was the Perdium estate. He remembered seeing it reduced to ashes, so why was it still standing? Ricardo smacked Ghislaine across the face, asking if he had a terrible nightmare or something. He couldn't believe Ghislaine was calling his own household a fallen one, since the Count would kick him out if he heard that. Ricardo wondered if he was dreaming right now. Ghislaine just took the hit, and muttered that he guessed he wasn't dreaming. The sting on his cheek was a painful reminder that this was real. Ghislaine's mind raced as he saw his younger face and the estate in its original state. It was like looking at a broken mirror, reflecting two different realities. Suddenly, it hit him. He had traveled back to the past. The realization sent a shiver down his spine. Ghislaine remembered how his younger self resented the household. The immaturity and feelings of being inferior led to trouble, and as time passed, more people from the household avoided him. Ghislaine remembered that he couldn't handle all the criticism back then, so he ran away from home. He was just a kid, after all. Turns out, Ghislaine became a mercenary after that. He fought in tons of battles, got stronger, and made a name for himself. Ghislaine continued, remembering that he returned to the Ferdium County to fix his past mistakes. But when he got back, his household had already been destroyed, and he lost everything. But now, it was all still standing right in front of him. The Perdium flag waved in the wind, untouched. Ghislaine was so happy that all the people he cared about were still there. He couldn't believe it, and he felt like singing out of joy. Ghislaine knew it was too early to celebrate. He remembered that they were supposed to raid the orcs, and he knew he couldn't forget that day. It was the day most of the raid squad would die. He remembered the scene of the raid. Bodies were scattered everywhere, covered in blood and dirt. It was a massacre. Ghislaine recalled that in his past life, he had followed the orc raid squad, hoping to make a name for himself. At that time, the report said there were only 3 orcs, but when they got there were more than 20 orcs waiting for them. Almost everyone ended up dying because Ghislaine had been stubborn and wanted to command the squad. Ghislaine figured it should be doable enough, since those orcs didn't really have a strategy. The problem was whether these guys would trust him, since they all thought he was some useless scumbag. Ghislaine smirked, looking up at the scaffolding that had just been destroyed. He seemed almost happy about the destruction around him. The soldiers were caught completely off guard. They shouted that it was the orcs, their voices full of fear. The orcs were already upon them, axes raised and ready to strike. The soldiers screamed that the orcs were here, but it was too late. Ghislaine looked surprised, almost caught off guard. He wondered if the orcs had arrived this quickly in his past life as well. The orcs started tearing through the soldiers, leaving a trail of blood and bodies. It was a brutal scene, just like Ghislaine remembered. Raid Squad Commander Scovin shouted for everyone to get into formation. He ordered them not to panic and to get into a defense formation immediately. An orc swung its massive axe, taking out multiple soldiers with one swing. They didn't even have time to scream before they went flying. One of the soldiers realized they had let their guard down. He was pissed that they were getting ambushed when they weren't prepared at all. He shouted that there were way more orcs than they had been told, and at this rate, they were all gonna die. Another soldier screamed that there was an orc right behind Commander Scovin. The orc was already raising its weapon, ready to strike. The orc's axe smashed into the ground with incredible force, right where Scovin had been standing just a moment before. The ground cracked from the impact. The orc's axe was coming down fast, and Commander Scovin knew he couldn't dodge it. He braced himself for the hit, closing his eyes. Suddenly, Scovin heard a sound that made him open his eyes. At the same time, Ghislaine was moving at lightning speed, taking on the orc. Scovin couldn't believe what he was seeing and called out, "Young master?" Ghislaine was a blur of motion, his sword slicing through the orc like it was nothing. The monster didn't even have time to react. The orc collapsed in pieces, and Ghislaine was covered in its blood. He didn't even flinch. The man yelled, completely stunned. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Ghislaine stood his ground, looking down at the remains of the orc. The monster was torn to pieces. Ghislaine looked at his hand, annoyed. He realized he couldn't use mana yet. He wished he had traveled back to the past sooner. Ghislaine looked down at the commander and demanded that he hand something over. "You're the commander, right? Give it." Commander Skovan looked up at Ghislaine, completely confused. "Sorry," he asked. Commander Skovan straightened up, looking directly at Ghislaine. He seemed to be trying to understand what was happening. Ghislaine looked down at the soldier, then declared that he wanted the right to command. He was serious, not joking around. Raid Squad Commander Skovan looked absolutely shocked. What? He asked himself. How could Ghislaine ask for command at a time like this, when soldiers were dying? Ghislaine just stared back, looking a little stunned himself. He realized that he couldn't just take command like that. Skovan looked back at him, completely speechless. Skovan asked if Ghislaine thought this was some kind of game, even if he was the young master. Skovan said he couldn't just give up the authority that the Lord gave him so easily. Meanwhile, Ghislaine looked annoyed by Skovan's words. Suddenly, a massive orc came charging at them, swinging its axe. It looked like they didn't have time to argue, not with that monster bearing down on them. The armored man yelled at Ghislaine to fall back. He added that Ghislaine was still too inexperienced to lead the troops, so he should just stay out of the way. Ghislaine looked down, feeling a bit annoyed. He guessed he had no choice but to listen to the guy. Ghislaine suddenly punched the armored man right in the face. The guy went flying backwards from the force of the blow. Ghislaine's punch sent the armored man stumbling backwards, and immediately the man yelled at Ghislaine, asking what he thought he was doing. The armored man looked completely confused. He didn't understand why Ghislaine would attack him like that. The sword pierced right through the orc's head, killing it instantly. The massive creature teetered for a moment, before finally collapsing. The orc's body crashed to the ground, a sign of victory in this battle, and immediately, the nearby soldiers stared in disbelief at the fallen monster. Ghislaine looked at Skovan, clearly thinking about something important. He asked Skovan if he knew what the most important thing in battle was. Ghislaine continued, explaining that there was no hope of winning a battle when the troops were filled with fear. The soldiers looked nervous, wondering what he was gonna do. Ghislaine's eyes flashed with determination as he spoke. He declared that they needed to gain momentum, a smirk playing on his lips. Ghislaine held up a hand, silencing the nervous soldiers. He needed them focused, not panicking. Ghislaine didn't wait for their fear to take root. He leaped over the heads of several orcs, getting the jump on them. He spun through the air, sword flashing. Orcs fell left and right, their blood splattering the ground. Ghislaine stared down at his sword, now dripping with orc blood. He yelled for the orcs to come at him. Ghislaine's eyes burned with rage as he scanned the remaining orcs. He promised he was going to kill every last one of them. Ghislaine was surrounded. He spun, his sword a blur, desperately trying to keep the orcs at bay. Each swing was a gamble, a desperate attempt to survive. He didn't let up. Ghislaine sashed at an orc, the blade tearing through its flesh. Blood splattered as the orc roared in pain, but there were so many more. One of the orcs watched the young master fight. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. He thought to himself, am I dreaming? Even as a mana user, it's hard for me to do anything. So how is that skinny young master doing all of this? Ghislaine was starting to feel it. Sweat poured down his face, and his muscles burned. He was getting tired. He was pushing himself to the limit. But Ghislaine wasn't just swinging wildly. He was using the smallest of moves to dodge attacks, and using his superior swordship to strike at their weak spots. Ghislaine had the skill of a manaless swordmaster. It was as if a red aura was starting to surround him. The orc looked surprised at Ghislaine's strength. Ghislaine shouted that he still wasn't warmed up, asking if that was all they had. Ghislaine taunted them, saying they weren't living up to their reputation as a warrior species. He then started running away, as all of them charged at him. The soldiers watched the young master run away, and one of them asked if he was really running. Another soldier shouted for the commander. The commander looked absolutely furious. He wondered what the hell Ghislaine was thinking. Ghislaine was running into the group of orcs and drawing their attention, which seemed like a good move, but running away now, and in that direction, it was the edge of a cliff. He was leading them straight to it. The commander's eyes went wide. Wait, a cliff? He finally understood what the young master was planning. The commander shouted, telling the troops to raise a shield wall. As he gave the order, the soldiers quickly formed ranks, raising their shields in unison. One of the soldiers shouted that they would follow the first son. They were ready to follow Ghislaine into whatever crazy plan he had. Ghislaine was still fighting the orcs, leading them closer and closer closer to the cliff's edge. The situation was getting pretty dangerous, but he didn't seem to care at all. Ghislaine told Scoven he was sure he had figured out what his plan was. If he was a skilled commander, he admitted he would have preferred to take them all down himself, but his stamina just wasn't up to it. Because of that, the orcs were getting pushed closer and closer to the edge of the cliff. Ghislaine smirked, saying that even with his low stamina, it should be enough for them to handle. The orcs screamed as they were pushed over the cliff, falling down to what was surely their deaths. The soldiers used their shields to push the orcs over the edge. They were so close to the cliff now that the orcs had nowhere to go. Yes, Ghislaine smiled, clearly satisfied with how things were going. Everything was falling into place. High above, the orcs tumbled down the cliff, falling to their doom. At the same time, Ghislaine looked up at them, ready for what was next. The commander screamed at the troops to push the orcs off the cliff, and immediately they surged forward, shields raised. The orcs struggled against the soldiers, but there were too many of them. Meanwhile, the commander yelled, his face red with effort. The orcs fell from the cliff. They were screaming as they fell, their bodies twisting in the air. The orcs continued to plummet, their screams fading as they disappeared into the mist below. It was over. The explosion ripped through the last of the orcs, sending blood and body parts flying everywhere. Below, the soldiers cheered, exhausted but alive. They had managed to kill all those orcs, and they were happy about it. The soldiers started yelling for the young master. They were clearly worried about him. The young master was falling off the cliff, his body twisting in the air. It looked like he was done for. A soldier reached out, trying to grab the young master before he fell completely. He yelled at him to grab his hand. The young master looked up, but he couldn't reach. He just couldn't grab the soldier's hand. Ghislaine was falling, and there was nothing to grab onto. He yelled for someone to hold on. At the same time, below, one of the soldiers looked up in horror. The soldiers all yelled out, calling for the young master. They were scared he was gonna die. A small voice called out, just barely audible. It was Elena. She was calling for Ghislaine, her voice full of worry. Ghislaine looked up, his eyes widening. He could have sworn he heard Elena's voice. Elena? He thought. The reflection of Elena appeared in broken shards. She asked if their mom was gone, thanking Ghislaine. Then she asked what was wrong with him these days, saying he was the worst. Ghislaine stood alone, lost in the darkness. He looked down at his open palm, his expression unreadable. Ghislaine muttered that these were his memories of Elena. At the same time, someone punched him in the face. Young Elena was reaching out and asked to go together. Tears streamed down her face. Ghislaine woke up with a start, sweat dripping down his forehead. He stared blankly at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what just happened. Ghislaine woke up in a bed, inside a familiar room. He was alive. It seemed like they had saved him. He sat up, rubbing his forehead. Was that all just a dream? His entire body ached. It had to be the consequence of pushing his body to the limit. Well, I guess it made it easier to know that he was still alive. Suddenly, a voice called out, "Master?" Belinda rushed into the room, looking relieved. Ghislaine looked at her, confused. "You're awake, Belinda." Belinda hugged Ghislaine tightly, asking if he knew how worried she was. She wondered if they should have let the soldiers handle the orcs. She was clearly relieved to see him alive. Belinda asked what he was doing and if she had done something wrong. Ghislaine told her no, he was just glad to see her, his personal tutor. Since he was little, she was the only one who continued to stay by his side, despite his idiotic antics. But after the family fell to ruins and she went missing, he was no longer able to see her again. He remembered her shoe being left behind. Ghislaine thought he never thought he'd get to see her like this again. He wondered why she was so happy when they saw each other every day. He needed to tell Belinda the truth. Ghislaine told Belinda to listen to him carefully, because a catastrophe would soon strike Ferdium. Belinda was confused and asked what he was saying. The truth was, Ghislaine told Belinda that he died and came back to life. Belinda didn't believe him for a second, joking that a cat almost killed him. Ghislaine was frustrated and tried to explain that he wasn't talking about that and that Ferdium was in grave danger. Belinda scolded Ghislaine, warning that if he kept making a scene like this, he'd end up in jail. He realized that she didn't believe him, so this wasn't going to work. Belinda asked him what he would have done if he was too hurt to even go to the festival. Belinda reminded him about the festival, asking if he already forgot about it. She explained that Lady Elena had been waiting for the day to go to the festival with him, clearly trying to cheer him up. Belinda said it would be a great chance for the two of them to become close to each other again. Ghislaine remembered that there was a festival that always happened around this time of year, and he stared at the picture of Elena. Ghislaine thought thought that in his past life, he didn't have time to enjoy festivals because of his traumatic experience. He sat alone in the dark, regretting his actions. Belinda wondered how long it would be until the festival. She figured it was about a week away. Ghislaine's mind was racing as he thought about that week. The day that changed his life kept replaying in his head. He remembered Elena asking if he was inside, a memory that continued to haunt him. He remembered Elena begging him to go with her. Her eyes were filled with tears as she reached out to him. Ghislaine knew that 1 week later, Elena would die. He was determined to change that future, no matter what it took. Ghislaine suddenly pulled Elena into a hug. She was caught off guard by the sudden closeness. Belinda was furious, her face red with anger. "What's wrong with you? What kind of prank is this?" she demanded to know. Below, Elena looked up at Ghislaine, confused by Belinda's outburst. Ghislaine looked down at Elena with a soft smile. He quietly said that he had missed her. Elena, clearly creeped out, pushed Ghislaine away with surprising force. "Let me go! You're creeping me out!" she shouted. Ghislaine stumbled back, shocked by her strength. He wondered if she had always been this strong. Belinda stepped forward, her expression still hard. She stated that she was the one who asked Elena to be there. She then demanded to know what game Ghislaine was playing, and if he thought this made everything okay. Ghislaine looked confused, asking what she was referring to. Ghislaine, looking absolutely furious, yelled that he told her to get lost because she was annoying. He added that just feeling her breath felt disgusting. Elena looked at him shocked as he realized he had said all that out loud. Ghislaine suddenly looked calmer, but also ashamed. He quietly admitted that he wasn't the closest with Elena in his past life, and that he had been a complete piece of trash. He quickly apologized. Belinda, holding Elena, looked completely stunned. She asked if Ghislaine had apologized first, and if he had hit his head after she heard an orc had taken him out. Ghislaine insisted that he really had taken them all out. Below, he looked absolutely pissed and demanded to know why they kept implying that he had gotten hit. Elena sarcastically said that he had gotten them in that state, and that he had come back unconscious. She told him to come on now. Belinda and Elena were both smiling brightly, clearly enjoying each other's company. Meanwhile, Ghislaine was kneeling on the floor, filled with regret. Ghislaine stared ahead, his expression hardening. He thought to himself that everyone was as he remembered them, and wondered why the past version of himself had wasted so much time on useless things. Ghislaine remembered the festival that was coming the next week. He recalled that he had rejected Elena's offer to go together, making up some excuse that the events from the raid squad had upset him. That was the last time Ghislaine had seen her. He remembered that Elena's body was later found shredded to pieces, along with her bodyguards. Below, the brutal scene of the massacre was still fresh in his mind. Ghislaine clenched his fist, his knuckles turning white. He thought he should have been with her, no matter what. Ghislaine was kneeling on the ground, looking up at them. He asked if they could head inside. 2 guards in full armor stood at attention. They announced that Miss Elena had arrived. These were her bodyguards, Jamal and Philip. Belinda asked Elena if something had happened to her that she had to wait outside. She apologized, explaining that the servants had asked Elena to oversee their work on the festival supplies. She wondered why they would ask Elena to do that. Below, Ghislaine looked up, confused and concerned. Belinda told Ghislaine that he wouldn't know anything anyway, because he always lazed around all day. She wondered why there was such a shortage of workers in Ferdiem, that even the young lady needed to work. She then said she was heading out, and that Ghislaine should take care of himself. She added that she didn't care about these things back then, so it was obvious that she didn't know. Meanwhile, Elena walked away with her bodyguards. Ghislaine stood up, looking determined. He offered to help as well. Elena looked up, clearly confused by his offer. Belinda wondered if Ghislaine had really gotten hit in the head. Why else would he volunteer to help? The market square was bustling with activity as people set up stalls and prepared for the festival. Servants hurried around, carrying supplies and decorations. Ghislaine shouted that he had offered to help and for them to get out of his way. He added that people would be too scared to work with them around and that they should stay out of trouble. Below, workers continued to set up for the festival, trying to ignore the commotion. Ghislaine realized that Elena's body would be found near the slums, far from the festival grounds. Someone must have killed her there or forcibly moved her there. Because of that, he knew he needed to learn the layout of the castle to prevent it. Ghislaine winced, holding his face. One of the servants looked at him, concerned, and exclaimed, "Ghislaine, my lord, that face." Old man Fergus seemed relieved to see Ghislaine. He was thankful that Ghislaine was well. He said that he had come as soon as he heard the news about the orcs, but that they could stop talking about it now. At the same time, Ghislaine leaned on him for support. Belinda said that it was great timing, and that old man Fergus should take Ghislaine back to his room, since he was acting weird after waking up. Old man Fergus agreed that he would. Ghislaine thought that this This damned hooligan image was getting in his way again. Ghislaine figured that it couldn't be helped. He'd get to know what was going on around the castle better in the following week. Ghislaine asked Old Man Fergus if there was an abandoned training field in the castle, and told him to take him there. Old Man Fergus was confused and asked why. Ghislaine simply said that he wanted to train. Old Man Fergus seemed surprised by his request. Old Man Fergus agreed to take him there. He said that it was this way. Ghislaine's eyes widened as he took in the sight before him. He was clearly surprised by what he was seeing. Ghislaine looked around the training area, impressed. He said, "What? It's in a much better condition than I expected." Ghislaine thought that it was a perfectly suitable location to train at. He had never seen anything like this as a mercenary. Old Man Fergus replied that they kept it maintained in case he wished to use these facilities. Old Man Fergus looked at him with a small smile. He said that he was certain that what Ghislaine was going through was just a phase. Ghislaine stared at Old Man Fergus, lost in thought. He wondered if Old Man Fergus had also acted this way in his past life. Ghislaine looked down, lost in his thoughts. So that's what had happened, he thought to himself. Ghislaine said he needed to live a long life because dying really felt like trash. Old Man Fergus asked him to beg his pardon, since he was said to have already experienced life and death. Ghislaine smirked, replying that Old Man Fergus was sharp, and that he actually did die and was resurrected. Old Man Fergus responded that he thought that was enough tomfoolery, my lord. Ghislaine told Old Man Fergus that he could head back, and that he was going to start training. He added that he would be just outside. Ghislaine thought to himself that he had always treated everyone around him like they were his enemies, but he realized he was just short-sighted back then. He was starting to regret his actions. Ghislaine thought about the week ahead. Back then, it was revealed that the one behind Elena's death was a lord from a neighboring territory. The war had dragged Perdium to its end, a dark flag waving over the destruction. And the thing is, Elena's death was the starting point of it all. That meant he had to set things straight, starting now. Ghislaine looked absolutely determined. He needed to fix everything from here on out. First things first, Ghislaine needed to get himself into better shape. It sucked that he didn't have a lot of time, but he should at least be able to control mana. Mana was a supernatural resource that allowed humans to break through their limits. Most people said that noticing and taking in the mana was the hardest part, but he was able to do that, even on the chaotic battlefield. Ghislaine had to connect the mana particles floating in the air and bundle them up as if he was spinning a spool. He focused, trying to feel the energy flow. Ghislaine sat there, mana swirling around him. He figured that for someone like him, who'd been through tens of thousands of battles, creating a mana core was a piece of cake. He wasn't just relying on talent, though. Ghislaine had a method from that half-burned book on magic that he picked up, and because of that, he was able to stand with the strongest 7 of the land. He was using the natural mana core of humans to his advantage. Ghislaine could create a second, and even a third. The power was flowing through him. He was creating a connected mesh of multiple cores. As a result, he could create an explosive force. The energy was almost too much to handle. Ghislaine coughed up blood as he kneeled down. 3 was his limit, for now anyway. Even though he was able to reach 5 in his past life, he stared at his hand, still covered in blood. This method allowed one to create an explosive force in a short time, but it also required an extremely large amount of mana. In return, it was a dangerous game he was playing. That loss to Idun still stung. It was the primary reason he had lost in his past life. He remembered bringing a whole Night Order to fight against him when he had run out of mana. He was sure he would have won if it was a fair fight. He clenched his fist, looking down. It was inherently an unstable technique, but this was enough for now. He had a youthful body and a lot of time now. He would get his revenge and take Idun's head this time. His face twisted in rage. Even those bastards standing behind House Delphine, who helped destroy their country, he would destroy them all. 1 week later, it was the day of the festival. The castle loomed in the distance, unaware of the storm about to break. Ghislaine tightened his sword belt, preparing for whatever might happen. He had a bad feeling about this festival, and he wasn't going to be caught off guard. Sword at his side, Ghislaine walked through the festival. People bustled around him, enjoying the festivities, but he was on high alert. He scanned the crowd, searching for any sign of danger. Suddenly, Elena stopped dead in her tracks. Her eyes widened in surprise, and she stared directly at Ghislaine. Elena looked looked surprised to see him. She said, "Wow, you really came. What happened? You never come to these sorts of things." Ghislaine responded that, as a Perdium, he should at least come to festivals every once in a while. Elena narrowed her eyes, looking at him suspiciously. She told him he'd been acting real odd recently, and that she'd heard he'd been doing nothing but training in the past week. Elena asked what was so wrong about the next in line of a Knight family training. She didn't care about these kinds of things before. She reminded Ghislaine that he was the one who said their dad was annoying, and that he wished he was the Lord already. Elena smiled and said that she liked the way things were now. Ghislaine remained silent, listening to her every word. Elena looked at him, commenting that it seemed like the old him was back. Meanwhile, Ghislaine was lost in thought, considering his next move. Ghislaine realized something in the past week. He understood that his actions had changed, so his reception and the future were also slowly beginning to change. Belinda told the guards to figure it out themselves if the young master created trouble. She warned that they really couldn't afford to have any problems, especially with a lot of visitors. She told them not to worry. They could trust her. The general flow of things might be the same, but it was difficult to know how his actions would impact everything. He had to consider every possibility. Making good use of the information from the future was his job. Ghislaine knew he needed to respond to each situation effectively. Ghislaine's preparations were complete. He felt a surge of confidence. Everything was ready, and immediately, Ghislaine grabbed Elena's hand, and they ran together through the town. That was fun. The castle stood tall under the night sky. Ghislaine admitted that the festival was getting a little boring, since it was the same every year. He wondered if the reason nothing new had happened was because he was with Elena. The festival was almost over, but nothing special had happened yet. Ghislaine asked Elena if she wanted to check out other areas too. He knew from a friend that there were new events elsewhere. Elena seemed excited by the idea. Elena grabbed Ghislaine's hand, telling him that this better be fun. But then, someone spoke from behind them. Ghislaine turned around, staring at the person and wondering if it was them. The newcomers had a sinister look on their faces, closing in on Ghislaine and Elena. "The traitors of our house," they shouted, their voices filled with hate. The group of people moved closer, blocking any chance of escape. "We're here," one of them yelled, his eyes fixed on Ghislaine and Elena. The street was deserted, with no one around to help. The only sound was the wind whistling through the empty buildings. One of them scoffed, looking around with disgust. He wondered what this was all about, and if anyone would actually perform in a dump like this. He added that they probably weren't ready yet, and that people would be here soon. "Don't make me laugh. Would you want to perform in a place like this?" One of the men spoke, saying that this was all as expected. He said that this looked like a simple deserted street at first sight, but looking at the traces of chaos, he was checking the escape route. The armored man declared that preparations must have been made in advance. Ghislaine told Elena to go, but she wasn't having it. Elena refused to watch any show in a dump like this. The armored man asked if Elena worked out, wondering why she was so strong. Elena looked completely puzzled by the question. The armored man ordered them to wait a little longer. Below, Elena looked concerned, calling out Philip. Elena asked why they were acting so strange, clearly spooked. The armored man apologized, saying he didn't mean to scare her. The armored man said it was just that a reasonable request had come in. Elena looked shocked, asking what he meant by a request. They walked into the town square, but something felt wrong. There was a strange tension in the air, like they were walking into a trap. Suddenly, 3 cloaked figures appeared, walking towards them. The way they moved was unsettling, like they were gliding instead of walking. Frank stepped forward, his face partially hidden by his hat. He said that, as expected, their work process was clean. Frank continued, saying that they had brought the young lady, as promised, so they should end the deal right there. He seemed eager to get out of there. Frank looked confused, asking if that wasn't the eldest son of the Perdium family. He didn't think he had requested to bring him here. Below, Ghislaine stood next to Elena, looking unfazed. Frank smirked, saying he would just hand him over for free. He added that Ghislaine had followed them foolishly, not knowing this would be his graveyard. Down below, Ghislaine heard Frank accuse Jamal of selling them out, asking if he really thought he could get away with it. Frank smiled, telling them to worry about themselves first. He figured all they had to do was run away to a faraway place. He went on to say that they were just getting sick and tired of this impoverished land, tormented by the barbarians anyway. Frank was sure there were plenty of others leaving Perdium besides them, right? Ghislaine stood there, sword in hand. Frank looked shocked, unable to say anything. Elena watched as Ghislaine stood over Frank, who was now lying dead on the ground. Ghislaine declared that at least the others never sold them out. The attacker wondered how Jamal, that idiot, could lose to an amateur like that. Below, Jamal stared up in disbelief as a sword pierced right through his head. Jamal was stunned, unable to believe what was happening to him. It was impossible, he thought, as the sword went all the way through. Ghislaine stood next to Elena, looking down at Jamal Jamal's lifeless body. The rain started to fall, washing away the blood. The observers wondered if that was really the eldest son of Perdium. They thought he'd never had any real combat experience or fundamental training. Judging by his appearance, one of them thought he wasn't mistaken. Although they were taken off guard, Ghislaine instantly killed 2 knights. The observers realized that Ghislaine's attacks used mana. Ghislaine stood over Jamal's corpse, the sword still stuck in his head. Elena grabbed onto Ghislaine, clearly scared. She asked what the hell was going on. Ghislaine's face was blank, showing no emotion at all. He just stared ahead. Elena screamed, her voice full of terror. Ghislaine knocked Elena out cold, and immediately, a man thanked him for doing the work for them, calling him the eldest son of Perdium. Around the area, the knights lay dead on the ground. Meanwhile, the man with the pipe admitted that Ghislaine was much different than what he had heard. He wondered if he had been hiding his true skills. Ghislaine held his sword, the blade dripping with blood. He wondered aloud what it mattered to them. Below, he looked down at the men with a cold stare, muttering about the number of enemies. The man with the pipe stood with 2 other cloaked figures. He said that the 2 beside him were nothing, but the one in the middle had mana on a different level. Ghislaine knew he had to end this quickly. Meanwhile, below, he asked the group who had requested this hit. He figured there was no need for a dead man to know that. Ghislaine figured they wouldn't say it so easily. No matter, he thought. Ghislaine was sure that they would spill it soon enough anyway. The leader in the black cloak said that they shouldn't sever his head. Instead, they should capture him alive and break every limb in his body so that he couldn't help but go mad. The leader went on, saying that he had to writhe in pain for the shape to come out beautifully. He seemed to enjoy the thought. The leader's men shouted their agreement and charged forward. As a result, one of the attackers hit the eldest son of Perdium with a stick. The eldest son of Perdium realized it was a trap and shouted, "Firecracker!" He looked absolutely furious. The stick slammed into the eldest son of Perdium's face with full force. He was immediately swarmed by the attackers, who were all trying to take him down at once. The eldest son of Perdium deflected the blow with ease. He scoffed, saying it was a shallow trick. The eldest son of Perdium didn't give the attacker a chance to recover. He pressed forward, his sword a blur of motion as he aimed to end the fight quickly. The cloaked figure tried to block, but the eldest son of Perdium was too fast. His blade danced around the clumsy defense, searching for an opening. The eldest son of Perdium's sword found its mark, slicing through the air. Blood splattered as the cloaked figure stumbled backward, clutching at the wound. The eldest son of Perdium stared down at his fallen opponent. He looked absolutely furious. The eldest son of Perdium's attack crashed against the other man's defenses, sparks flying as their blades met. Below, the swords were locked in a stalemate, neither giving an inch. The attacker was clearly surprised that the eldest son of Perdium had managed to block his attack. He thought it was a perfect sneak attack too. The eldest son of Perdium didn't waste a second. He rushed forward, his swords aimed at the attacker. The eldest son of Perdium's swords moved faster than the eye could follow, each strike precise and deadly. As a result, the attacker was sent flying backward, blood splattering everywhere. The attacker's pipe went flying through the air, a clear sign of the force behind the eldest son of Perdium's blow. The eldest son of Perdium's sword came down with incredible force, ready to end the fight, but the attacker managed to block the strike at the last second, clearly surprised that he was still alive. The attacker was surprised he was still alive. If he hadn't been lacking in mana, he would have been beheaded just now. He wondered how the eldest son of Perdium had survived a strike to his neck. Had he focused his mana around his neck to reduce the damage? The attacker held his sword steady, ready for another strike. He had no clue how the eldest son of Perdium had learned such a strange swordsmanship at that age. The attacker grinned, revealing his scarred face. He declared that the eldest son of Perdium would die right there. The attacker was surrounded by a bright blue light, his mana flaring. He sneered, confident in his power. He told the eldest son of Perdium that there was no way he could beat him with such weak mana. The attacker's face was twisted with rage, his eye glowing with power. He was going to make sure the eldest son of Perdium died right there. The eldest son of Perdium grinned, holding his swords ready. He looked like he was actually enjoying himself. The attacker's eye widened, confused. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. The eldest son of Perdium was smiling. Before the attacker could react, the eldest son of Perdium moved like lightning. The attacker was cut across the chest, blood spraying everywhere. Ghislaine didn't give the attacker a chance to recover. He unleashed a flurry of attacks, each strike aimed to disable. The attacker was bleeding, but he still had the nerve to talk. He told Ghislaine that his mana was too weak for any of this to work. Suddenly, the attacker coughed, blood splattering on the ground. He couldn't believe what was happening to him. him. The attacker was completely shocked. He couldn't understand how Ghislaine's attack had been so powerful. He realized that the true culprit behind Elena's death was standing right in front of him. Ghislaine was surrounded by a red glow, his eyes burning with rage. He told the attacker that he was the one he was looking for. Ghislaine's eyes burned with an intense light as he prepared to unleash his full power. He warned the attacker to brace himself because he was about to unleash his third core. The attacker was completely caught off guard by the sudden surge of power. He asked in disbelief how Ghislaine had managed to boost his mana so much, and immediately, Ghislaine attacked with incredible speed, daggers flashing. The attacker could barely keep up, realizing just how fast Ghislaine had become. Meanwhile, Ghislaine pressed his advantage, attacking with a flurry of sword strikes. The clash of steel echoed through the air as Ghislaine relentlessly attacked. Each strike was delivered with precision, forcing the attacker to struggle to defend himself. The attacker was struggling to block, exclaiming that the force of Ghislaine's attacks was making his hands go numb. He was starting to wonder how Ghislaine could draw so much mana, since it usually had a limited effect. Because of that, the attacker's sword started to crack under the force of Ghislaine's blows. The attacker was stunned, blocking Ghislaine's attacks with difficulty. He exclaimed that he had never heard of a method that could increase mana so explosively. The attacker continued to struggle to keep up with Ghislaine's attacks. He realized it was as if Ghislaine had become a completely different person. Ghislaine didn't give him a moment to breathe. He attacked with such force that the attacker's sword started to crack. Ghislaine pressed his attack, shards of the attacker's broken sword flying everywhere. He moved with incredible speed, not giving the attacker any chance to recover. Ghislaine stood over the attacker, who was now bleeding and defeated. The attacker was done for, with no hope of winning. Ghislaine didn't hold back, going all out against the attacker. Every strike was thrown with the full force of his body behind it, blood splattering everywhere. The attacker screamed in pain, blood gushing from his mouth, and immediately after, Ghislaine's fist slammed into his face, knocking him to the ground. Ghislaine stood over the attacker, ready to get some answers. He grabbed the attacker by the neck and asked him to finish their conversation from before, demanding to know who had requested this attack. The attacker was in bad shape, but he wasn't giving up just yet. He muttered that he wasn't going down so easily, his hand reaching for a hidden knife. The attacker, with a desperate look in his eyes, announced that he would at least take Elena Perdium with him. He raised the knife, aiming it at the young girl. The attacker screamed, trying to stab Ghislaine with the knife, but immediately after, red threads shot out, wrapping around the attacker's arm. Ghislaine grabbed the attacker, his eyes cold and unforgiving. He offered to make a deal, saying that if the attacker answered his question, he would sheathe his sword. The attacker realized he was trapped, unable to move. He wondered when Ghislaine had created those threads, using mana. At the same time, Ghislaine's hand glowed with blue mana. Ghislaine was sure someone of the attacker's skill would know how to patch himself up. He was completely unfazed. Ghislaine threatened that it wouldn't matter if he destroyed the attacker's mana core. The attacker looked absolutely shocked by what he heard. Ghislaine held the attacker's arm tightly, his mana flowing around it. The attacker looked absolutely terrified. The attacker realized his mana was scattering. He didn't understand how this was happening. Ghislaine asked if the attacker was out of his mind, warning that one wrong move could cause an explosion and blow everything away. He added that self-destruction was for the unskilled. Ghislaine replied that he could manage it. He looked completely calm, like there was nothing to worry about. The attacker realized Ghislaine wasn't bluffing. He was really going to do it. The attacker's eye reflected a terrible truth. He was about to die. He knew it was over. The attacker, on the verge of death, revealed everything. He blurted out that it was Count Desmond who had ordered the attack. He explained that Desmond needed a reason to start a war against the Perdium and Degard families. Ghislaine realized that it was Desmond. He thought to himself that in his previous life, this sort of dirty work was left to families allied with the ducal house. He wondered how Duke Delphine dared to orchestrate this nonsense behind the scenes. Ghislaine asked if that was why he wanted to kill Elena. The attacker, barely alive, could only nod in agreement. Ghislaine finished him The attacker, barely alive, could only nod in agreement. Ghislaine finished him off without hesitation. He looked down at the body, his eyes cold. The attacker coughed up blood, asking what Ghislaine was doing. He said this wasn't what he expected. He wondered if Ghislaine was scared, now that his own end was near. Ghislaine just stared down at him, a smirk playing on his lips. Ghislaine's eye twitched as he chuckled. The sound echoed in the air, a promise of pain to come. The attacker spat out that nothing would change, even if Ghislaine killed him. He claimed he'd already finished the work with with the Dagard. He asked if anyone would listen to a punk like Ghislaine, saying the Perdium would perish because of the war. Ghislaine stared back at him, his expression unreadable. Ghislaine raised his hand, ready to end the conversation. He had something to say. Ghislaine declared that he was reborn after dying, so things would be different this time. He looked absolutely sure of himself. The attacker screamed, his face contorted in fury as power surged around him. He looked like he was about to explode with energy, and immediately, a beam of pure energy shot straight up into the night sky. It ripped through the darkness, heading somewhere far above. The beam slammed into a building, sending chunks of stone flying everywhere. Ghislaine stood in front of the destruction, his eyes narrowed. The ground was littered with bodies, a grim reminder of the fight. Below, Ghislaine was panting heavily, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Ghislaine stood over Elena's body, his face stained with blood and sweat. He stared down at her, his expression unreadable as the night grew quiet. Ghislaine lay on the ground, struggling to catch his breath. Above him, his sword was stuck in the ground, covered in blood. Ghislaine's face was contorted in pain as he clenched his teeth. He was clearly not ready to give up. Ghislaine struggled to his feet, his body aching. He muttered that exploding 3 cores had been nothing back when he was the Mercenary king. Ghislaine pushed himself up, his eyes burning with determination. He wouldn't fall here, not like this. Ghislaine glanced down at Elena's body, a sudden realization hitting him. He remembered that in his previous life, they had found another body, besides Elena, at this place. He recalled what the guy had said earlier. The leader in the black cloak turned away, his expression unreadable. Below him, the son of Dagard lay dead, covered in blood. The leader figured that the son of Dagard had been killed along with his escort knight, so that was how they silenced them and framed them as Elena's killers, huh? The leader realized that the moment this was revealed, the war would begin. He decided they needed to erase this evidence. The leader held a lighter in his hand, ready to burn everything. Ghislaine, carrying Elena, declared that he wouldn't let things happen as the leader intended. He had to protect Elena. Ghislaine ran as fast as he could, carrying Elena away from the chaos. The leader watched him go, his expression hidden by the shadows. The mission had been a total failure. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. The leader was absolutely furious. He shouted, asking how they couldn't even take care of just one girl when he sent guard knights and Frank, who was supposed to be the best they had. He wondered if they let their guard down because they thought it would be easy. The subordinate stammered, trying to explain that it was all because of Ghislaine Perdium. He looked terrified of the leader's reaction. The leader scoffed, asking if he was talking about Ghislaine, that useless trash from the north. He asked if the subordinate was seriously trying to use him as an excuse, since everyone knew Ghislaine was a useless piece of garbage. The subordinate insisted that Ghislaine was completely different from the information and rumors they had. He seemed genuinely shocked by this. Ghislaine moved with incredible speed, his blade a blur as he cut through his enemies. He was a whirlwind of destruction, each strike precise and deadly. In the end, blood splattered across the ground, a testament to his power. The leader's face was a mask of disbelief as he realized something was very wrong. It was as if Ghislaine was a completely different person, and immediately, Ghislaine walked forward, seemingly unaffected by the chaos around him. The subordinate pleaded, saying they had already taken care of things with dragons, so starting the territorial war wouldn't be an issue. He begged for one more chance, but the leader cut him off, shouting that he couldn't even find out enough information on one kid. He asked if the subordinate realized how much of a setback this had caused, and how he dared ask for another chance after failing such an easy mission. The leader, his face twisted with rage, ordered the men to eliminate Ghislaine, and immediately, a cloaked figure knelt before him, ready to carry out the command. All this drama? Ghislaine thought it was too noisy. The leader paused for a moment, considering the situation. He slowly agreed, simply saying, yes. The leader stared down at the subordinate, his eyes burning with intensity. He demanded to know what kind of chance the guy wanted. The subordinate, desperate to redeem himself, shouted that he would get rid of Ghislaine Perdium, and immediately, he explained that he would make a duel happen naturally. The leader was curious, wondering who the subordinate had in mind. Down below, the other subordinates waited anxiously for the answer. The subordinate revealed that the person he had in mind was Kane Loops. He explained that Kane was famous for his self-created swordsmanship, and, despite his young age, had become a powerhouse. The subordinate added that he could confidently say that Kane was a monster in the north, and a match for the top strength. The subordinate added that Kane was also Ghislaine's cousin, so he was sure it wouldn't be hard to get them to meet. Below, the leader listened intently, waiting for him to continue. The leader's face was hidden in shadow, but his voice was clear. He warned the subordinate that if he failed again, the leader's eye glowed with a menacing light. He finished his warning, saying there wouldn't be a next time if he messed up again. The subordinate responded immediately, promising that he wouldn't disappoint the leader. Meanwhile, back at Perdium Castle, the training hall was quiet. The air was still, but that wouldn't last for long. An armored knight suddenly shouted, warning the young master that something was coming towards him. At the same time, a bright blue energy ball hurtled forward, leaving a trail of power behind it. Immediately, the knight prepared to strike, his sword glowing with the same blue energy. As a result, a blade of pure energy cut through the air, heading straight for the approaching ball. The knight's grip tightened around the sword, his knuckles white with tension. He focused all his power into that one swing, ready to meet the energy ball head on. Ghislaine stood in the training hall, watching the knight's display of power. He seemed impressed, but also a little surprised by what he had just witnessed. He muttered, "All right, that should do." Fergus approached the knight and said, "Oh, old man Fergus, sorry, you were so focused on your training." He paused, his curiosity getting the better of him. He asked, "How did you do that just now?" Ghislaine held up a glowing string of light, a strange look on his face. He asked, wondering what it was. Ghislaine explained that it was a mana thread, a way of using mana like a string. He looked closely at the glowing strands, his brow furrowed in thought. Ghislaine recalled that he used to use mana thread all the time in his past life, but with his current skill level, he would need to use too much mana to use it like he used to. Ghislaine realized that if he just made one thread to use less mana, he could still use it despite having less mana. A grin spread across his face as he figured it out. Fergus admitted that he thought he had trained his mana for a long time, but he had never seen anything like this. He was clearly impressed by Ghislaine's control. The man was stunned, he thought to himself, wondering how Ghislaine was suddenly able to use mana like that. Just a while ago, he didn't even train it. Ghislaine asked if the man wanted something from him. The man responded that he just wanted to stop by to say something. He seemed a little nervous. The knight thanked Ghislaine for protecting the young lady. Ghislaine replied that it was just something he should have done. He seemed a little embarrassed by the praise. Ghislaine suggested that they go eat. He was probably starving after all that fighting. A few days passed after that. The festival was paused, which made sense, since a guard knight tried to traffic the young lady. What a scumbag. Elena was getting annoyed. Everyone thought she was lying when she said Ghislaine was the one who saved her. She thought they should say something to them, but she knew it was fine, since they wouldn't believe them anyway. At the same time, other people sat around a table. Belinda realized it was Jamal and Philip who were trying to take Elena for themselves. Those scumbags. Belinda knew they were perverts. Below, Ghislaine thought about how Elena lived. Ghislaine had been able to stop the war from happening, but he was sure they wouldn't give up. He couldn't stop them on his own forever, so he realized he needed to grow a military force. Because of that, he knew he had to get more into politics. Ghislaine interrupted, excusing himself. He knew he had to get more into politics in order to do that. He'd have to get used to it fast. He was already getting pulled in different directions. Ghislaine was confused. He asked Belinda why they were getting dessert first. Belinda reminded him that he knew how their situation was. They had bigger problems than bread. A man lay on the ground in shock, probably from the recent events. At the same time, a man below yelled, demanding that they compensate the damages they had caused with the cancellation of the festival. A man was trying to calm down the crowd, but it was no use. The crowd was shouting, demanding compensation. They were saying that the people inside were swimming in money and should come out. Ghislaine looked out the window, confused. What the hell was going on out there? Belinda turned to Ghislaine, explaining that she knew they'd do this. She reminded him that their county was full of merchants who made a living from the profits that came from the festival, right? The crowd continued to shout. Since the festival was cancelled after just one day, it made sense that they were upset. Ghislaine looked worried. Was the county situation really that bad? This wasn't good at all. He realized that the crowd would only get more aggressive if he didn't do anything about it. Ghislaine turned to old man Fergus, demanding to know what the soldiers were doing. He ordered him to send them down to calm that crowd down. Fergus told him that they didn't have any soldiers. Ghislaine was shocked. Most of them had been sent to the Forest of Monsters for the reforestation because of the orc raid. Because of that, they were all there. Perdium was basically eternally at war because of the barbarians to the north. And on the other side, there was the Forest of Monsters from where monsters could come from at any moment. No money, no soldiers. What a mess, he thought. Ghislaine called out to Belinda, telling her that they needed to talk. He reminded her that she was the one that managed his money, right? He wanted to use that to calm down those merchants. Belinda looked right at him and said that there wasn't any money left. She didn't even try to soften the blow. Ghislaine asked her why not. Belinda reminded him that he'd been spending money like water, and the account was cut off. Ghislaine's eyes widened. He didn't have any money at all? He was broke? Ghislaine asked Belinda to lend him some money, but she just chuckled and said she didn't have any either. He should have seen that coming. Damn it, he thought. No money, no soldiers. What the hell did they have to work with? He sat by the window, looking out over the city, trying to figure out a solution. Without even a little bit of money, there was nothing he could do, even if he knew what was going to happen in the future. Ghislaine knew he was going to need money first. Someone came running, shouting about whether there wasn't something on the estate that could be sold, and immediately after, the door slammed open as Ricardo burst in, looking panicked. He was yelling for the young master. Ghislaine looked up, surprised. He asked Ricardo what was going on and why he was in such a hurry. It was rare to see him this worked up. Ricardo stammered, saying there was a problem. He announced that young Master Kane wanted to see Ghislaine. Ghislaine looked confused, repeating the name Kane to himself. Nearby, someone was getting beat up pretty badly. The guy's face was covered in blood, and he looked like he was about to pass out. The attacker's fist was covered in blood as he prepared to deliver the final blow. The impact would be devastating. The attacker's fist was covered in blood. He was clearly enjoying beating the crap out of this guy. The guy on the ground was barely conscious, just barely clinging to life. And immediately after, Ghislaine appeared in the doorway, looking down at the scene. The injured man on the ground managed to stammer out, "Young master?" Ghislaine's expression hardened as he took in the brutal scene. A voice cut through the air, cold and confident. Kane Loops had arrived, and he announced, "There you are." Kane Loops towered over Ghislaine, casting a long shadow. The air crackled with tension, and Ghislaine knew this wasn't going to be a friendly chat. Kane Loops stared down at Ghislaine with a smirk. He greeted him casually, saying, "Hey, Ghislaine." Ghislaine stared at Kane Loops and realized he knew that face. He thought to himself, turns out it was Kane Logis, the heir of the Logis County. They had an alliance with his family. Ghislaine thought back to his relationship with Kane. He had been his only friend at one time, and also his greatest enemy. The air was thick with tension as Ghislaine looked at Kane. He couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was about to happen. Ghislaine turned to Ricardo, asking what was going on. Ricardo stammered, you see, we responded to a report of a disturbance at the tavern." Ricardo explained that they found Kane Logis at the tavern with his escort knight. Kane recognized them and asked if the rumors about Ghislaine were true. So, Commander Scovan explained the details of the rumors to him. Kane grabbed the guy by the throat, lifting him off the ground. He demanded, "You dare lie before the heir of Logis?" Ricardo looked nervous. He muttered, and that was how it happened. The guy who got choked started talking. "Hey now, if you're gonna tell him, you better tell him the truth. He claimed that you, who's never even trained, took down an orc with your bare hands and dealt with the treacherous escort knights yourself. That's why I just gave him a little wake-up call to knock some sense into him." On the ground, the injured man groaned. Kane stared down at Ghislaine, clearly not happy. "This wouldn't have happened if you didn't lie in the first place," he said, his voice cold. Ghislaine was thinking about Kane. He had always treated him like he was less important. Every time Kane visited Perdium, he always made a mess. Even after causing all that trouble, no one could say anything, because Ghislaine was basically his subordinate. No one looked down upon Kane, but Ghislaine always had an inferiority complex. Kane's confidence and bold behavior were praised as qualities fitting of an heir. That's why Ghislaine was criticized more. He closed his eyes, remembering those harsh words. Ghislaine thought to himself, look at this guy, huh? Usually, Kane would have charged at him with this much provocation. We're going back in time a bit, to Logis County. It was a while ago. Someone asked, sounding surprised, "What? Kill Ghislaine?" The cloaked figure replied that if he succeeded in this task, the esteemed one would support the Logis family. The cloaked figure explained that it wasn't hard to deal with a punk like him, but Ghislaine was also an heir to his land, so they could lure Ghislaine into a duel, making it look like an accident. And immediately, he added that he would go with him as his escort knight to plan everything, so there was nothing to worry about. The cloaked figure said that this was a rare chance, even for him, but the muscular man was thinking about how he would have to kill his own cousin, Ghislaine. Kane Logis looked impatient and said that they should leave right away. Kane Logis wondered if they wanted to eliminate Ghislaine because something about him had changed. He was starting to get a bad feeling about this. Ghislaine, who was nearby, looked over and asked what was going on. While some guys were fighting in the background, Kane Logis demanded to know why the other man was standing still. He told him to bring the thing that had been prepared for him. Cain added that they should liven up the mood and have an amazing time. Cain Logis stared intensely and asked if he was wrong, buddy. Ghislaine stood there calmly, his hands casually tucked into his pockets. He seemed to be waiting for something to happen. Ghislaine started talking, remembering the past. He said that Cain Logis always had him prepare alcohol and women every time he came around. Below, the memory showed him being forced to do just that. Ghislaine was getting annoyed as he continued. He said that he only did it back then because he didn't want to get beaten up, but not anymore. The memory showed him being scolded for wasting so much money. Ghislaine's eyes narrowed, a sudden realization hitting him hard. He knew exactly what he needed to do. Ghislaine realized that his source of money had been right here all along. He stared down at the orb, a plan forming in his mind. Ghislaine heard someone calling his name. He looked up, wondering who was yelling at him. Cain Logis was sitting down and demanded that if Ghislaine remembered what he asked for, he better bring it to him right now. Cain seemed really impatient. Cain was still waiting, looking annoyed. He was clearly expecting Ghislaine to hurry up. Ghislaine looked up at Cain, a thought crossing his mind. But then he asked if Cain didn't have a debt to repay to him. Cain was confused and asked what he needed to repay him for. Ghislaine fired back, reminding Cain that he'd been paying for all the stuff Cain asked for with his own money. Ghislaine demanded 1,000 gold, principal plus interest. Cain was shocked, saying that it shouldn't have even cost him 100 gold. Cain Logis got right in Ghislaine's face, ranting about how he only kept doing all those favors because he thought they were friends. He said it was like he was paying some friendship fee. He was furious that he had been used like a doormat for so long. Ghislaine glared at Cain, telling him to pay it all back before he beat the crap out of him. He said he was short on cash and needed the money right now. The words caused a commotion. People started fighting around them, unsure what was happening. Ricardo watched the scene unfold, confused, and asked what the young masters were doing. Cain stepped on the hand of someone on the ground. He asked Ghislaine if he was starting to act all tough, just because he'd been going easy on him. Cain looked down on Ghislaine, sneering that he seemed to think he could spread rumors about a knight. He called Ghislaine a parasite leeching off the land, and said that everyone in the north knew he was a scoundrel who only sucked up to his heir, talking garbage. Cain Logis yelled at Ghislaine to get himself together, and immediately he swung his fist down towards Ghislaine's face, ready to beat him up. Ghislaine leaned back, dodging Cain's punch at the last second. He watched Cain carefully, trying to figure out what he was going to do next. Cain screamed that Ghislaine was a little before throwing another punch, but Ghislaine blocked the attack with his arm, stopping Cain from hitting him. Ghislaine didn't waste any time and punched Cain right in the face. The force of the hit made Cain's head snap back. Cain's eyes widened in shock as he got punched. He didn't expect that at all. The punch connected with Cain's face, and you could practically feel the force behind it. At the bottom, Ghislaine stood there, staring back with cold eyes. Cain was sent flying, crashing onto the ground with a thud. At the same time, one of Cain's men rushed over, yelling to see if the young master was okay. Ghislaine towered over Cain, telling him to get up and stop whining. He knew Cain had blocked the hit, so he wasn't buying the act. One of Cain's men shouted at Ghislaine to stand back, asking what he thought he was doing. Meanwhile, the other guys there were just as shocked, wondering if Ghislaine had really just beaten up Cain. Cain smirked, his eyes narrowing. So, that's how Ghislaine wanted to play things, huh? The speaker smirked, asking Ghislaine how he liked his acting. Ghislaine just looked at him, waiting for the next move. The speaker grinned, saying it was excellent. He had set the stage perfectly to make it appear that the fault lay with Ghislaine in everyone's eyes. This should be more than enough to justify a duel. Of course, it was a rare opportunity to gain such powerful backing, and he had to make sure to leave a lasting impression this time. At the top, the scene showed two men talking about how if he succeeded in this task, the esteemed one would support the Logis family. Meanwhile, the speaker clenched his fist, thinking this was the perfect time to cut off Perdium, a falling power. Cain shouted, asking how Ghislaine dared to attack him simply for trying to verify the truth, after tarnishing the dignity of nobility with lies. And immediately after, the view shifted to Ghislaine on the ground. Ghislaine looked down at Cain, who was still on the ground, and accepted the challenge. He challenged Cain Logis to a duel. Cain Logis accused Ghislaine of insulting him, the heir, in front of the people of Perdium, and he was also furious about the assault on his knight, saying that Ghislaine had tarnished the dignity of nobility. Meanwhile, his knight was still on the ground, clearly in bad shape. Cain stared intensely at Ghislaine, His eyes narrowed. He asked if Ghislaine was thinking of denying what he had done. The air was thick with tension. Everyone watched Ghislaine, waiting to see what he would say or do. Ghislaine chuckled, a nasty smile spreading across his face. He already knew Cain was stupid, but he didn't know he was stupid enough to dig his own grave. So, he accepted the duel. Below, his hand gripped the hilt of his sword. Cain smirked. Looking down at Ghislaine, he warned him not to regret it, even if he died. Ghislaine stared down at Ricardo, his blue eyes piercing. He needed to get things moving. Below, Ricardo responded nervously, confirming that he understood. Ricardo took a deep breath and shouted, his voice echoing through the area. He was going to carry out Ghislaine's orders, no matter what. Ghislaine looked down, a sly grin on his face. He told Ricardo to bring all the merchants protesting in front of the castle, promising to make them big money. The festival was suddenly cancelled. The atmosphere, which had been so hyped up, cooled down just as quickly. Some tourists couldn't even leave because of it, which really sucked for them. They were stuck in a state of frustration, unable to spend their money or enjoy their time. Ghislaine knew that something had to be done to help the tourists. He figured that if an event were to take place, it would definitely soothe them. Ghislaine stood tall on the platform, looking out at the crowd. He was about to make an announcement. The crowd went wild, announcing that it was a duel between young Master Cain and Ghislaine. They were betting their money on young Master Cain, hoping that he would finally teach that punk a lesson. The merchants were doing everything they could to make a sale. They were shouting that their goods were cheap, and they were offering a buy one, get one free deal. The betting promoter was yelling for everyone to place their bets, trying to hype up the duel. At the same time, coins were flying through the air as people rushed to bet on young Master Cain, since it was supposedly the safest bet. Young Master Cain was furious, saying that it was wrong to turn a sacred duel into a marketplace like this. He then warned that his sword wouldn't stop, not even if his opponent surrendered. Ghislaine listened to what Cain said, a slight smirk forming on his face. It seemed like that was exactly what he wanted to hear. Ghislaine announced that, since it seemed like enough people were satisfied, they could begin. The crowd waited with bated breath. The betting promoter looked down at his papers, looking bummed out. Turns out, nobody had bet their money on Duke Ghislaine, which was probably not a good sign for him. Ghislaine stared forward, lost in thought. He was probably thinking about the fight, or maybe he was just bored. The betting promoter yelled that the result was obvious, and that Ghislaine didn't stand a chance against young Master Cain. He then told everyone to find an idiot dumb enough to bet on the other side. The promoter turned to Ghislaine, smirking. He told him that even the marketplace was ignoring him. The promoter suggested changing the conditions of the bet. He proposed that people bet on how long Ghislaine could last against young Master Cain. As a result, a guy threw a bag of money on the table. A man in armor put his money on the line. He announced that he was betting on Duke Ghislaine. The air crackled with anticipation as the duel was about to begin. Below, a massive bag of money sat on the table, representing the stakes of the upcoming fight. Suddenly, Lady Elena spoke up, announcing that she wanted to bet on her big brother, too. Beside her, Belinda watched with a small smile. Ghislaine looked shocked, clearly surprised that Lady Elena was getting involved. Below, one of the men looked back at her, equally surprised. Lady Elena declared that the money should be enough. She reminded them that she had advised against this whole thing. Young Master Cain, at the bottom, looked annoyed that he had to wait. Young Master Cain told Ghislaine to get ready. He said that since he was older, it'd be strange for him to make the first move. Ghislaine just stared back, holding his sword. Ghislaine gripped his sword tightly. He was ready to face whatever came next. Ghislaine raised his sword high, ready to strike. He was focused on his opponent. Ghislaine stared down at Cain. His eyes narrowed. At the same time, Cain glared back, equally intense. Ghislaine held his sword steady, ready to fight. He told Cain that it was too late for him to act like the older one now. Cain charged forward with incredible speed. The force of his movement stirred up the air around him. Ghislaine swung his sword down with incredible force. Cain struggled to defend himself, barely managing to block the blow. Cain's eyes showed pure fear. He knew he was in trouble. Ghislaine stared down at Cain, his face twisted in anger. He told Cain that he had already stooped too low to save face now. Meanwhile, Cain struggled to block Ghislaine's relentless attacks. Ghislaine didn't let up, swinging his sword again and again. Cain barely managed to keep up, blocking each strike with a desperate parry. Ghislaine's sword moved like lightning, each strike carrying immense power. Cain was pushed back further and further, struggling to stay on his feet. The crowd was going wild, cheering for young Master Cain. They were sure that Ghislaine wouldn't even be able to land a single hit. Cain was smirking, clearly enjoying the attention. A man asked Lady Elena what they should do. saying they had to stop the duel right away. But Elena said it was too late. Anyone who dared cross swords with Cain was already trapped. Cain was moving fast, forcing Ghislaine to block each strike. At the same time, someone explained that Cain's opponents were always overwhelmed by his power. They would use all their energy just trying to dodge. The exhausted opponent, after dodging for a while, would eventually leave an opening, and as a result, they would meet their end, beaten on the ground. Cain was still smiling, confident as ever. He told Ghislaine that his skills had actually improved from before. Ghislaine readied his sword, realizing that Cain's movements actually made sense. He was starting to understand Cain's strategy. Cain attacked, taunting Ghislaine, telling him that he was always good at running away, even back in the old days. He seemed to be enjoying himself a lot. Ghislaine was sent flying into the air from the force of the blow. He had no chance to defend himself. At the same time, a man in the crowd shouted, "Young master!" But from below, Cain declared it was over for Ghislaine. He was sure of his victory. Cain brought his foot down, shouting that Ghislaine would die right there. The ground cracked from the force of the impact, and Ghislaine's face was filled with pain. Ghislaine looked down at Cain, ready to strike. He thought that he wanted to go easy on him. Ghislaine came down on Cain with his sword. He shouted that Cain had crossed the line. Ghislaine landed on his feet, his eyes narrowed in determination. He was ready to continue the fight. Ghislaine had recovered, using mana to steady himself. Below, a man in the crowd looked on in disbelief. He wondered if Ghislaine had really managed to return to a stable state by condensing mana into his legs. Cain looked down at Ghislaine with a smirk. He said that Ghislaine's swordsmanship was ignorant. He must have thought he was the strongest just because his opponents got scared if he showed even a little bit of his strength, huh? Meanwhile, the crowd watched on, unsure of what would happen next. Ghislaine held his sword out, telling Cain that he was going to open his eyes. But Cain wasn't impressed. He asked how Ghislaine planned on doing that. Ghislaine didn't waste any time. He immediately swung his sword down at Cain, moving so fast that the air cracked. Their swords met with a deafening crash. The force of it sent splinters of wood flying from the floor. Cain was sent flying back, barely managing to block the blow. He gritted his teeth against the pain. Despite the setback, Cain recovered quickly. He clashed with Ghislaine again, their swords sparking with each hit. Ghislaine screamed at the top of his lungs, putting everything he had into the swing. He was going to make sure Cain didn't get up again. Ghislaine's sword came down on Cain with incredible force. At the same time, someone watching the fight thought it looked like a video game. Ghislaine stared down at his opponent. His eyes narrowed. He wasn't going to let up, not even for a second. Ghislaine stood over Cain, his sword still raised, and immediately, Cain was on the ground, barely able to move. Cain was lying on the ground, bleeding and bruised. His sword was next to him, useless. It was over. The crowd couldn't believe what they were seeing. They were shouting about how Duke Ghislaine had improved so much. One of them was regretting his bet, since he had put his money on Master Cain. At the top, Lady Elena watched the fight with Belinda, the maid. Down below, Cain was lying on the ground, his face full of pain and frustration. Ghislaine was thinking that the wound wasn't deep enough. He wondered if he had done it on purpose. Cain was still on the ground, bleeding. Ghislaine wondered how he could have shown such a high level of swordsmanship. It was like he had been training for this his entire life. Ghislaine stood over Cain, his sword at the ready. He was completely focused on the fight, ready to end it once and for all. Ghislaine thought that such a gap in skill wouldn't provide enough entertainment, and immediately after, his sword clattered to the ground, joining the others that had been knocked from their owner's hands. Ghislaine looked over at Cain and announced that he'd be fighting barehanded from now on. He seemed pretty serious about it. Cain looked absolutely shocked, his face twisted in disbelief. He couldn't believe what he was hearing, and he thought that he should use the opportunity to teach Ghislaine a lesson. Ghislaine smirked and started rolling up his sleeve, showing off his bare knuckles. He was ready to fight, no sword needed. Ghislaine stared down at Cain with a look of utter confidence. He asked if Cain was really going to educate him. Ghislaine started rolling up his sleeve, his eyes never leaving Cain. He told him that it seemed like Cain was no match for him with swords, so he'd give him a handicap and fight barehanded, which Cain was good at. Ghislaine declared that he'd bet 2,000 more gold that he'd win. Down below, the crowd was in shock. They couldn't believe that Ghislaine would bet that much. The man watching was stunned. He couldn't believe that Ghislaine would challenge Cain to a barehanded fight. He was grateful for Ghislaine's insanity, and he thought that fortune was on their side. The announcer shouted for everyone to place their additional bets, reminding them that the event was now a barehanded fight between Ghislaine and Cain. Meanwhile, some in the crowd were saying that they were going to bet on Cain because challenging him in sheer force was just stupid. But this time, they seemed to think Cain had a chance. The crowd was getting rowdy. and the bets were flying in. One guy shouted that he was putting his money on young Lord Gizlen. Young Master Kane was still on the ground, but he was laughing. He thought the idea of a bare-handed fight was hilarious. Gizlen dropped the swords to the ground. He was ready to fight without a weapon, just like he promised. And immediately, young Master Kane was sent flying. He was thrown into the air like a rag doll. Young Master Kane shouted that he was going to use the sword. Turns out, he was lying about the bare-handed thing. The crowd was getting restless. A woman with white hair yelled that young Lord Gizlen was an asshole and should pick up his sword. The blonde woman beside her seemed to agree. Young Lord Gizlen looked down at young Master Kane, his eyes cold. He muttered that he was going to knock some sense into him. Young Lord Gizlen didn't waste any time. He swung the sword with all his might, the blade whistling through the air. The sword slammed into young Master Kane. The force of the blow sent him flying backwards, crashing into the ground. Young Lord Gizlen stood over young Master Kane, who was now lying motionless on the ground. He stared down at the guy, not showing a single bit of mercy. Young Lord Gizlen was fast. He dodged the clumsy attack with ease, twisting his body to avoid the blow. And immediately, he countered with a strike of his own. The headbutt landed with a sickening crack. Because of that, blood sprayed from young Master Kane's forehead as he staggered backwards. Blood poured down young Master Kane's face. He was clearly hurt badly. Young Master Kane groaned in pain. He had lost the fight. Young Master Kane was lying on the ground, looking up in disbelief. At the same time, one of the spectators watched from above, wondering how young Lord Gizlen could move like that. Young Master Kane was down, but not out. At least, that's what young Lord Gizlen thought. He looked down at his opponent and taunted him, telling him to get up because he hadn't even gotten started yet. Young Master Kane was furious. He was not going to let this punk beat him. He was ready to keep fighting, no matter how much it hurt. Young Master Kane swung his sword with all his might. He was desperate to land a hit, any hit, on young Lord Gizlen. The two men clashed again, swords meeting with a loud clang. Sparks flew as they traded blows, each trying to gain the upper hand. Young Lord Gizlen fought with a renewed vigor, pushing young Master Kane back. He told him that he couldn't even look him in the eyes until now, and that he used to bow down whenever he showed up. As a result, young Master Kane was knocked to the ground again, defeated. Young Lord Gizlen didn't hold back. He swung his sword down with all his force, ready to end this fight once and for all. The blow was aimed straight at young Master Kane, and there was no way he could dodge it. Young Master Kane was lying on the ground, defeated and covered in blood, but he wasn't giving up just yet. He spat out blood and said that he had to kill young Lord Gizlen to secure their Logs family's future. The force of the blows kept hitting young Master Kane over and over. Each strike was like a hammer, crushing him further into the ground. He couldn't even move, much less defend himself. Young Master Kane was a mess. Blood was everywhere, and he was barely conscious. He was just lying there, taking it. It was a brutal end to what was supposed to be a fair fight. Young Master Kane was barely alive. He looked up at young Lord Gizlen with a mix of confusion and pain. He managed to croak out one last word. Why? Young Master Kane was getting pummeled. Each strike was worse than the last, and he could barely see straight. Young Master Kane was still being hit. He was a brutal mess. At the same time, young Lord Gizlen was remembering something. He thought that he pitied Kane's father, Count Loges. Count Loges had helped Perdium until it was almost destroyed, just because he was friends with Gizlen's father. Young Lord Gizlen thought that Kane's father was a good man. However, his son had a different plan in his head. Meanwhile, young Master Kane was still taking a beating. Young Lord Gizlen remembered a few years before. He remembered when Kane was sending more support to Perdium. Young Lord Gizlen remembered someone saying that even if they were friends with Count Perdium, they were having a hard time themselves. Why would they continue to invest in a land that was dying? It was like pouring water into a cracked bucket. It hadn't even been a week since his return, but he was already going back to help Perdium? Young Master Kane begged his father, Count Loges, not to go. He was desperate to get him to listen. Count Loges just looked down at his son, not responding. Count Loges' son, young Master Kane, asked why he insisted on helping Perdium when everyone was trying to stop him. He couldn't understand why his father was so stubborn. Meanwhile, young Master Kane was still lying on the ground, beaten. Young Master Kane's face was a mess. Blood dripped from his nose and mouth, and his eyes were swollen shut. Young Lord Gizlen struck down on young Master Kane. He made sure to hit him hard. There was no other reason for Count Loges to help Perdium, he thought. Young Lord Gizlen stood over young Master Kane, who was lying on the ground, completely defeated. He said that this should have taught him enough. Young Master Kane's face was a mess. He could barely see, and and his head was spinning. Young Lord Gizlan reached down, offering a hand to young Master Kane. He told him to get up. Young Lord Gizlan's hand hovered there, waiting, but young Master Kane refused to take it, his face a mask of pain and shame. Young Master Kane finally spoke, his voice hoarse. He admitted his defeat to young Lord Gizlan. The crowd was stunned into silence by the outcome of the duel. At the same time, hidden in the shadows, a masked man watched with narrowed eyes. The crowd erupted in cheers, celebrating young Lord Gizlan's win. People were shouting about winning their bets, while others were in disbelief. The blonde little girl jumped for joy, happy that her big bro had won the duel. The hooded man towered over young Master Kane, who was still kneeling on the ground. He was furious. He yelled at young Master Kane, asking how he could give up so easily, especially since he had trusted him. The hooded man grabbed young Master Kane roughly. Young Master Kane told him to let go, saying he was done. The hooded man scoffed, calling him a weak little brat. Young Lord Gizlan was smiling, which made the hooded man narrow his eyes. He realized that young Lord Gizlan was about to do something, but he had no idea what. Young Lord Gizlan raised his voice, addressing everyone. He announced that he was volunteering to pay for all the meat and drinks for everyone gathered there. The hooded man looked at him like he was crazy, wondering what he was up to. The crowd went wild, shouting about meat and drinks. They cheered for young Lord Gizlan, who'd promised them a feast. But the hooded man was furious. He told him he didn't agree to any of this, and demanded that young Lord Gizlan take back his words. Young Lord Gizlan calmly explained that this was the price for losing the duel. He added that the money for the meat and drinks shouldn't be deducted from the bet. He also reminded him to add 2,000 gold to the original bet of 1,000 gold. Meanwhile, the hooded man looked absolutely furious. Young Lord Gizlan stared down at the hooded man, warning him that he knew what would happen if he ran away. The air was thick with tension. The hooded man's eye widened in fear. He was clearly terrified of what young Lord Gizlan would do to him. The hooded man knelt down, finally understanding the situation. He mumbled that he understood, completely defeated. The next day, the castle stood tall against the morning sky. The town was slowly waking up after the previous night's events. Meanwhile, inside young Lord Gizlan's room, sunlight streamed in through the window. At the same time, on the table, lay the spoils of his victory, a mountain of gold coins. Young Lord Gizlan stared at the gold, his eyes wide. He couldn't believe how much money he had just won. Young Lord Gizlan thought to himself that he could hire a small mercenary group with that much money, but he knew it took too long to grow money, and they wouldn't wait for him. He needed to prepare faster to realize the business he had in mind. Suddenly, Elena asked what was up. She wanted to know where young Lord Gizlan planned on spending all that money. Belinda, the maid, stood beside her, also curious. Elena asked if he wanted some of the gold, but Belinda interrupted, saying she was just asking and that it was obvious where he'd use it. Belinda pointed out that it was Lady Amelia's birthday soon. She teased young Lord Gizlan, suggesting he put on such a show because he wanted to buy her a very expensive present. She added that he was so transparent and was just doing all that to look good to his fiancée. Young Lord Gizlan sat there, stunned. He asked if he had a fiancé. Down below, Elena and Belinda didn't let up. They teased him, saying he didn't have to be shy since they knew he was planning something, because he was embarrassed that they read his mind. They were talking about Amelia from Rayfold County. Young Lord Gizlan's eyes widened as it hit him. He finally understood. Suddenly, a dark image flashed in his mind. That woman, Amelia Rayfold. He remembered Amelia Rayfold as a noble among nobles, known for her kind nature and actions towards everyone, regardless of status. She had gained the deep support of the people in her territory. However, he also knew she would later incite rebellion and become known as the Witch of the North. Young Lord Gizlan's face twisted in fury. She had joined hands with the Delphine Duchy to drive the final nail into Peridium's downfall. A traitor, Belinda asked when her father would be returning, wondering if it would be soon. But Gizlan was already thinking ahead. A week, huh? That should be enough time, he figured. Gizlan suddenly announced that he would be visiting Rayfold County. Belinda was taken by surprise and asked why, since it wasn't even Amelia's birthday yet. Gizlan stated plainly that he was going to get money from them. It was all about the gold. She stared down at the shoes, carefully considering which ones to wear. It was an important decision. Belinda stared intently and told them to wear those shoes. She didn't take her eyes off them. The barefoot child looked up at her, tears in their eyes. "Lady Amelia," they stammered out. Amelia's expression hardened with resolve. She declared that if anyone had to walk around barefoot on her land, it should be her. Amelia ordered her guards to provide food and shelter for them right away. And right away, the people began hauling supplies, moving with a new sense of purpose. Amelia walked forward, her guards flanking her. All around, people kept thanking her, their voices filled with genuine emotion. Rayfold County, Amelia's garden. It was a place of peace. Amelia sat there with a man, the chaos of the outside world fading away. Burnoff was carefully cleaning Amelia's feet. He mentioned that his father had always demanded everyone in his territory obey him without question. Amelia gently petted the cat, its purrs filling the air. Burnoff continued, saying that people would always follow the one who took care of them, keeping them safe and happy. With this, she'd won their hearts. Amelia's face was serious, her expression unreadable, and right away, Burnoff was sent flying by a kick. Amelia looked at Burnoff with curiosity. She asked him what exactly had happened during his duel against the finest sword of the North. Burnoff apologized, explaining that he had avoided winning the duel to prevent unwanted attention. He added that if he were to stand victorious, people might start paying attention to Amelia. It wasn't yet the time to reveal her claws. Burnoff held Amelia's foot, bringing it close to his face. He said that his blade was hers, adding that he had invested so much to raise her. Amelia grabbed Burnoff's face, her fingers digging into his skin. She warned him that he wasn't allowed to be weak. The man asked about how things were going with the merchants. He explained that if she was talking about the Arctium Merchants Guild, there was no need to worry, because all the materials used for the reconstruction of the Perdium Defense Outpost were being purchased through their merchant guild. Basically, they were recouping all the surplus funds that Count Rayfold sent to Perdium each year. The man continued, saying that they were also recruiting all the soldiers and knights leaving Perdium. He added that many of them were well trained from battles against the barbarian tribes, making them excellent quality. Amelia said that was good, repeating that they needed to maintain the appearance of an ordinary merchant guild and be thorough. She warned that they couldn't let their true identity be exposed until they had fully built up their strength. Before excusing herself, a guard was blocking the stairs, but another man insisted on passing. He explained that the lady was resting and demanded to know who had allowed him to enter. The other guard replied that he had just gotten word from the gate that young Lord Ghislaine Perdium had arrived for a visit. Amelia's face twisted in anger when she heard the news. She wondered what that punk wanted. The guard looked up, stammering, clearly nervous about her reaction. The guard quickly added that Ghislaine claimed he wanted to discuss something about the merchant guild. He hoped this would calm her down. The guard led Ghislaine to the visitor's room. It was lavishly decorated, showing off Amelia's wealth. Ghislaine was already waiting inside, sitting casually on the couch. He greeted Amelia with a smile, saying hello. Amelia was clearly annoyed by Ghislaine's unannounced visit. She told him that this was quite unpleasant and asked if he hadn't learned any manners yet. Down below, Ghislaine remained on the couch. Ghislaine smirked, ignoring Amelia's coldness. He said that it was going to be her birthday soon, so he thought he'd give her the gift in advance. Ghislaine picked up a flower from the merchant guild up ahead, saying that the fragrance was quite nice. He added that he planned to buy flowers from there from now on. Meanwhile, Amelia was holding her cat. Ghislaine asked if the name of the merchant guild was the Arctium Merchant Guild. Below, Amelia glared back at him. Amelia said she wasn't sure what Ghislaine was trying to say. Now that she had received his gift, she'd be off. She said goodbye. Ghislaine watched her leave while taking a sip of his tea. Amelia wasn't messing around. She stared down at Ghislaine with cold eyes. She told him to sit down. Amelia felt a strange pressure coming from him. It was unreal. She thought to herself, wondering how this was coming from the same guy who used to squirm and barely speak whenever he stood in front of her. Ghislaine didn't waste any time. He said that they should get straight to the point and that he needed some money right now. He demanded that she give him 10,000 gold. Amelia looked at him, shocked. Ghislaine said that visiting and going somewhere were quite different from a large kingdom from her fiancé. Amelia fired back, saying that her father had nothing to do with this and that he should just give it to her. She asked if he wasn't planning to marry her anyway. Amelia stared intensely at Ghislaine. She was trying to figure out what he was up to. Amelia explained that if Ghislaine became the lord of the land, taking her escort knight would be more than possible. But before that, he should build up his power secretly in Rayfold, where the fight for succession was fierce. As she spoke, the cat lying lying next to Ghislaine, suddenly opened its eyes wide, looking like it was ready to attack. Ghislaine just sat there, the cat now a silent, watchful presence beside him. He didn't say a word. Amelia warned him that he shouldn't say something like that, not even as a joke. She said she would keep it a secret for a bit, but then she added that she might need to keep those words if she left the room empty-handed. She said that wasn't going to happen. Amelia suddenly shouted for Bernoff. The heavy doors to the room swung open. Bernoff walked into the room, looking directly at Ghislaine. He said it had been a while. Young Lord Ghislaine. Bernoff, the guy who was always at Amelia's side, was now standing before Ghislaine. He was a skilled person, said to be as good as the finest sword of the north. Ghislaine warned that if he died there, a war might break out. He asked if they were sure they could handle that. Amelia replied that of course they could. She explained that the world would hear that a sudden ruffian barged in, caused chaos, and was killed by the hand of the escort knight. Amelia ordered Bernoff to kill Ghislaine right there. Bernoff simply said, "As you wish, my lady." Ghislaine realized that was how they wanted to play. He paused for a moment. Ghislaine realized that he had no choice but to get a little serious. The two swordsmen moved so fast, it was hard to keep track of them. The clash of their swords echoed through the room. Rayfold looked absolutely furious. He accused young Lord Ghislaine of being an assassin, pretending to be polite while planning a surprise attack. Young Lord Ghislaine and Rayfold continued fighting. Ghislaine criticized Rayfold's poor hospitality, finding it amusing that he was complaining about manners in the middle of a sword fight. Young Lord Ghislaine argued that Rayfold was the rude one. He pointed out that arriving unannounced and upsetting the lady was hardly polite. Rayfold refused to be polite to someone like young Lord Ghislaine. The two men continued to trade blows, neither willing to back down. The two men were locked in a deadly dance, trading blows with incredible speed. Rayfold was sent flying, but young Lord Ghislaine didn't let up, coming right back at him with another attack. The fight continued, neither man willing to give an inch. Young Lord Ghislaine and Rayfold both knelt on the ground, their swords locked together, each struggling for dominance. Bernoff watched the fight with a growing sense of unease. He thought that young Lord Ghislaine was just all talk, but it was clear that he was no rookie. Rayfold looked at Bernoff, confused. He asked what Bernoff was doing, facing off against a punk like that. He then looked at Milady, concerned for her safety. Rayfold glared at Bernoff, his eyes filled with rage. He ordered Bernoff to hurry and bring him young Lord Ghislaine's head, demanding that Bernoff prove he was truly Rayfold's sword. Bernoff stared down the blade of his sword, his face grim. He vowed that he wouldn't disappoint Rayfold. Bernoff looked up, his eyes narrowed. He ordered young Lord Ghislaine to come at him. Young Lord Ghislaine looked down at Bernoff, a smirk playing on his lips. He asked if Bernoff, just an escort knight, dared to order him around. Young Lord Ghislaine admitted he was doing Bernoff a favor, but if he insisted, young Lord Ghislaine lunged forward, his sword a blur of motion. He said he'd do as Bernoff wished, and the fight was back on. Young Lord Ghislaine's eyes widened as he felt the sting of Bernoff's blade. He realized that this guy was fast. Meanwhile, Bernoff was equally shocked by young Lord Ghislaine's speed. The clash of steel and magic filled the air as the fighters battled with everything they had. Each strike was met with a counter, the tension growing with every parry and thrust. The woman looked absolutely stunned. She couldn't believe it. How could young Lord Ghislaine, who she'd heard called a lousy punk, be fighting Bernoff evenly? A surge of anger flashed in his eyes, but he was ready to fight. The swords clashed again and again, each strike carrying immense force. Sparks flew as metal met metal, the sound echoing through the room. His grip tightened on the sword, his eyes narrowed in concentration. He was ready to strike. Young Lord Ghislaine realized what was happening. He thought to himself, that again? The two swords met with a deafening crash. Each blow was aimed with deadly precision, neither fighter giving an inch. Bernoff looked absolutely sure of himself. He warned young Lord Ghislaine that his attack wouldn't work twice. The fight continued, a flurry of strikes and parries. The force of each impact shook the room. The sound of metal on metal echoed through the estate. The sparks from their blades lit up the room. Young Lord Ghislaine barely dodged the attack, twisting his body to avoid the blow. The force of the strike still sent a shockwave through him. Young Lord Ghislaine realized what was happening. He thought to himself that the enemy was enduring this using mana. Bernoff watched the fight, clearly impressed. He thought young Lord Ghislaine sounded quite different from what he'd heard, adding that you can't truly know someone until you fought them yourself. Rayfold declared that such a method might work in a chaotic battlefield, but not against him. He stated that young Lord Ghislaine's deviation ended there. Young Lord Ghislaine realized this was going to be difficult. The narrow, precise thrusts of the blade that constantly targeted the head messed with his sense of distance and timing. Rayfold stared down, thinking that young Lord Ghislaine wasn't an opponent he should have tried to take on yet. He thought to himself that things were going to get tricky, but he had no choice. Young Lord Ghislaine was running out of time, he thought. He had to end this quickly, so he started gathering mana in his hands. Rayfold noticed the strange energy around young Lord Ghislaine. He wondered if it was some kind of mana thread, something he hadn't seen before. Everything happened so fast. One moment, Rayfold was analyzing the mana, and the next, a sword had pierced right through him. He looked absolutely shocked. The fight was far from over. Young Lord Ghislaine and Rayfold continued to clash, their swords meeting with sparks flying everywhere. It was a brutal dance of death. Rayfold was stunned by what had just happened to him. Below, Bernaf screamed Rayfold's name in disbelief. Young Lord Ghislaine didn't waste a second and pressed his attack. He swung his sword down on Rayfold with incredible speed. Young Lord Ghislaine kept slashing at Rayfold, not giving him a chance to recover. He was determined to end this fight quickly. Bernaf turned to Milady, his face full of worry. He told her she needed to get out of there, because he couldn't promise she'd be safe if she stayed. Bernaf gripped his sword tightly. His eyes narrowed. He decided that from now on, he was going to give it everything he had. Young Lord Ghislaine paused for a moment, a small smile forming on his face. He admitted that he hadn't had such an entertaining fight in a long time, clearly enjoying himself. The woman stormed down the hallway, clutching the cat tightly in her arms. Her face was twisted with fury, her eyes burning with anger. The woman's face was red with rage as she screamed, wondering how Ghislaine dared to humiliate her like that. She was absolutely livid. The woman wondered who could have leaked information about the Merchant Guild to that madman, Ghislaine. She thought to herself that there was no way he would know about it in so much detail if not for that. The woman kept running, her mind racing. She wondered what on earth the guards she had stationed in advance were doing. The woman stopped in her tracks, her eyes widening as she took in the scene before her. Bodies were scattered all over the floor, lying in pools of blood. Perdium's maid stood calmly among the bodies, her eyes gleaming with an unsettling light. She spoke, remarking that it had been a while since she had seen the woman. The woman looked absolutely shocked, stuttering out Perdium's maid's name in disbelief, but the maid quickly silenced her, demanding quiet. The woman was confused, glancing down at something on her chest. Perdium's maid simply told her to be quiet. The woman looked disgusted, her face twisting in revulsion as she noticed the spider. Perdium's maid remarked that she still had that unpleasant spider on her lips, clearly enjoying her discomfort. Perdium's maid continued, explaining that it was during the engagement ceremony. She remembered eavesdropping on a conversation between Count Raylo and their lord. She revealed that the woman's siblings picked on her for having creepy spiders around her, so she raised the spiders herself and took her revenge. Perdium's maid held the woman tightly, the knife glinting dangerously close. She remarked that she wasn't sure if it was to overcome trauma or a display of self-assertion, but apologized, saying it didn't suit the woman. Perdium's maid stepped forward, her foot coming down hard. She asked for the woman's cooperation as the spider was crushed under her heel. Far from that scene, Ghislaine stood in a room filled with a strange, ominous energy. He was ready for whatever was coming next. Ghislaine looked up, sensing something strange. The air was rough, filled with an overwhelming amount of mana. The man sneered, asking if Ghislaine considered himself an entertaining opponent, something a lowly mercenary would say. He questioned how Ghislaine could call himself a noble, like his lady. Young Lord Ghislaine scoffed, saying that of course he was a noble. He added that he didn't think it was something a mere escort knight should even say. Young Lord Ghislaine moved with incredible speed. The clash of their swords echoed through the room. Young Lord Ghislaine roared, shouting not to disgrace the nobility. His sword glowed with a fierce light. The force of their collision sent sparks flying everywhere. Neither of them gave an inch, their blades locked in a deadly dance. The other man realized that young Lord Ghislaine was pushing forward so fiercely. He was starting to get overwhelmed by the attack. Young Lord Ghislaine shouted that he had enough of that. The clash of their swords echoed through the room as they continued to fight. Their blades met again and again, each strike carrying enough force to shatter stone. Sparks flew as their swords danced, neither willing to give an inch. The air crackled with energy as their swords collided, each blow a testament to their skill. The intensity of the fight was reaching its peak, and the sound of metal echoed through the room. They traded blows, each trying to find an opening in the other's defense. The fight was a blur of motion, a deadly ballet of steel. and determination. Young Lord Gizlan looked down at the other man, telling him that right there was his final attack. He seemed confident in his victory. Young Lord Quislane's face was twisted in anger, splattered with blood. He looked absolutely furious, clearly not expecting that hit. Young Lord Gizlan braced himself for the injury, using his shoulder to push the blade away. The metal scraped against his armor, sending sparks flying. Young Lord Quislane realized he couldn't let his guard down for even a second. He muttered that he'd have to stay focused until the very end. The clash of their swords echoed through the room as the two continued their deadly dance. Sparks flew as the blades met, each strike carrying immense power. Young Lord Quislane declared that the difference between them was that he wielded his blade with purpose, not for entertainment. He looked down at his opponent with a smug grin. The duel was a blur of steel and sparks as Young Lord Quislane and Young Lord Gislan traded blows. Each strike was met with equal force, the sound of metal on metal echoing through the room. Young Lord Quislane's expression shifted, a smirk playing on his lips. He thought to himself that this was turning out to be pretty entertaining. Young Lord Gizlan realized that Young Lord Quislane controlled the flow of the fight with overwhelming speed, range, and consecutive attacks. He thought that his attempts to counter him in close quarters through grappling were instantly shut down, and that he couldn't counter his strength with his current mana. Young Lord Gizlan thought to himself that it was a shame that he had to bring the fight down here. He was talking about the mana he had right at this moment. Young Lord Gizlan prepared to reveal what Young Lord Quislane had overlooked. He gripped his sword tightly, ready to unleash his hidden power. Young Lord Gizlan's eyes glowed with power as he focused his energy. He was about to unleash his unique mana cultivation technique. Suddenly, Young Lord Gizlan's attack gained incredible speed. It was his third tribe technique, Unleashed. Young Lord Gizlan's sword clashed against Young Lord Quislane's, the force of the impact sending shockwaves through the air. The power behind the blow was immense. Young Lord Quislane managed to block the strike, but the force behind it made his arms tremble. He could barely hold on. The two swords remained locked together, neither Young Lord Gizlan nor Young Lord Quislane willing to give an inch. The tension was so thick, you could shut it with a knife. Young Lord Gizlan was breathing heavily after taking a hit. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. How can Young Lord Shai-Gain wield such explosive mana during combat? He thought. Suddenly, a voice shouted, "Stop!" But it was too late. Young Lord Quislane was already moving in for the kill. Young Lord Quislane held his sword up high, ready to strike. Young Lord Gizlan was on his knees, looking up at him, waiting for the end. The woman tossed a bag of gold at the attacker's feet. "Take it, 10,000 gold. Take it and get out of my sight," she yelled. What a hassle. It would have been better if you just handed it over when I asked nicely. Perdium's maid spoke calmly to Amelia, even as the fight continued. "My goodness, isn't this a little too much to call it a lover's quarrel, young master? We just had a bit of a difference in opinion. I've got some unfortunate news for you, Amelia." Young Lord Quislane was looking down at them with a cold stare. He announced that the fee just went up to 20,000 gold. He wasn't gonna back down. The room was a mess. Soldiers lay scattered on the floor, their weapons cast aside. It was a total disaster. The floor was completely destroyed, shattered into pieces from the force of the fight. The power that had been unleashed in that room was unbelievable. Amelia stood there in shock, looking around at the ruined room. The man with the sword just stared at her like nothing had happened. The man apologized to Amelia, explaining that he had made a mistake in underestimating Gizlan. He admitted Gizlan was a strong individual and that he had emitted mana, surpassing that of an advanced level knight. "Gizlan Perdium, he's changed, huh?" The man looked serious as he asked Amelia if she wanted him to report what happened to the Delphine Duchy. The woman grabbed the man, warning him to watch his mouth. She reminded him how scary Duke Delphine was, and that if he found out about what happened today, they'd be done for. The man looked nervous, clearly understanding the gravity of the situation. The man explained that the reason he secretly allied with Duke Delphine without his father's knowledge was because they had a covert agreement. Duke Delphine would support the rebellion he would lead in exchange for his help in bringing down Perdium. He was scared that if this was exposed, his siblings would kill him. The woman's eyes narrowed, her face hardening with determination. She realized that if Gizlan knew the secret of the Merchant Guild, he might also know of their agreement with Duke Delphine. She declared that they had to do whatever it took to kill Gizlan. The man confirmed that he understood the plan. He reported that he had managed to leave light injuries on many parts of Gizlan's body, with a heavy one on his shoulder. Not only that, but because Gizlan had spent an explosive amount of mana, he wouldn't be in his best condition for some time. The woman explained that to not leave any traces, they couldn't use the knights from their their land. She revealed that they had trained others for times like this. The man realized what she meant. The man was surprised to hear that they would be using the wildcats. He didn't expect them to be brought into this. The man explained that the group consisted of war orphans, those without family, and those without status. He added that only the most talented natural-born specialists were among them, calling them the wildcat traffickers. The woman ordered them to send the wildcats to her. She demanded that they assemble a dozen of them or so, and only those who were proficient with mana. The man below seemed to understand. The man explained that the ravine was the only way to get from the Rayfold territory to Perdium. He added that it was an ideal place to securely march in, since the area was great and the terrain was rough, promising to get them prepared. He muttered Ghislaine's name. The woman swore that Ghislaine would pay for the humiliation he presented her with. She looked absolutely furious. The people in the carriage looked worried. They asked the young master if he was okay. He waved it off, telling them not to worry, that it was nothing serious. The young master examined his cuts. He said they weren't deep, and then explained that the 20,000 gold he received from Amelia was enough to cover the base funds needed to rebuild their territory. He was basically saving a few years. The young master thought to himself that it would have been great if he could kill Amelia too, but a war would have been unavoidable in that case. He couldn't risk the safety of their territory because of his momentary whims. The young master figured Perdium was having a tough time dealing with just the barbarians, so it was best for him to back off here. He knew that the fact that he knew about the secret of the Archeum Merchants Guild would put enough of a burden on Amelia. The young master stared forward with a determined look in his eyes. He thought to himself that this time he would make good use of them. Belinda looked at the young master, her expression unreadable. The air around them felt heavy, like something important was about to happen. Belinda looked at the young master and asked if things were going exactly as he had said. She seemed to need reassurance that everything was still on track. Belinda said that the young master told her to subdue the guards and take Lady Amelia hostage. The young master corrected her, saying that he had told Fergus to do that instead. The young master's eyes began to glow with a fierce red light. A strange energy crackled around him as he prepared to use his power. Belinda and the knight rushed to support the young master, who was clearly in pain. He explained that it was the recoil from opening up the third core, but it was still better than last time, even though it'd be troublesome to go through this every time he decided to use his power. The young master realized that he had to find a way to increase his mana, and fast. He looked at Belinda, wondering if she could help him. Belinda examined the young master closely, her hands glowing with mana. She told him that the flow of mana in his body was a mess. The young master's eyes widened in shock. He could feel something changing inside him. The young master realized that his tangled mana road had opened up a bit. He was amazed, knowing this was a method that couldn't be done without a deep understanding of mana. He thought to himself that he knew Belinda wasn't just an ordinary maid since his mother brought her. The young master wondered who Belinda really was. He didn't understand why someone so skilled was working as a head maid in the countryside. The young master knew it was good to have as many skilled people as possible on their land. He figured the ones he'd met so far were just the beginning. Belinda told the young master that she would help him with anything because she trusted him without question. She then asked the young master why he took such a huge amount of money from Lady Amelia, since she needed to spend money, but Amelia was the only rich person she knew. Belinda was shocked. She asked if breaking the engagement was the reason he took the money, adding that he would be in trouble once Count Rayfold found out about this. The young master assured her it would be fine, and that Amelia couldn't tell her father about this. Belinda asked the young master if he trusted her. When he said yes, she pressed him to at least tell the person who took the risk with him what he was going to use the money for. The young master looked at Belinda intently. He revealed that he was going to pioneer the Forest of Beasts. The young master announced that he was going to pioneer the Forest of Beasts. He looked determined to do it, no matter what. Fergus was shocked, telling the young master that he couldn't. He reminded everyone that development had been attempted there since the young master's great-grandfather's time, but it had never worked. Fergus then reminded the young master about the request he made before they entered the castle. Fergus confirmed that the person the young master had asked him to find was indeed at the location he mentioned, but he asked if the young master was sure that was the right person, since his condition was a little rough. The young master said that as long as he's alive, it's fine, and that they should head there right now. But Belinda protested, saying that they had to return home for now, and that he couldn't wander around in his current condition. She asked if the young master really thought Amelia would let them go easily after what they'd done to her. The young master realized that she probably wouldn't, and that she would likely try to kill him to silence him. Belinda said that she was good at fighting and that their master Ezus was still a knight, so she could just take care of it. The young master admitted that she was reliable, but that wasn't her role. He explained that it was a different field and that he needed a vanguard, and with that, they were on their way to meet this guy. The road ahead was long, and the destination was still a mystery. Finally, they arrived at a small village nestled amongst the mountains. A horse-drawn carriage pulled up to a worn-down house. The young master knocked on the wooden door. It was almost as if the house was abandoned, and the address said it was right here. The place looked like nobody had lived there in years. The door creaked open, revealing an old man with a long white beard. The young master was surprised, wondering who this was. Belinda looked at the old man with concern, saying that the young master was sure it was him. She didn't think he was in good enough shape to fight, suggesting they should think it over tomorrow. But the young master cut her off, confirming that this was the right place. The old man spoke with a tone that showed he didn't care, telling the young noble to get lost and not waste his time. But then he paused, as if he just realized something. The system revealed who the old man was. Gillian, the ex-captain of the Ratatosk mercenaries. Turns out, this old man was someone important. Gillian's eyes widened, a look of shock spreading across his face. He clearly wasn't expecting this visit. The young master smiled, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. He said that he had longed to see. The axe suddenly glowed with intense blue energy, crackling with power. It looked like it was about to unleash something big. The young master looked absolutely shocked, his eyes wide with surprise. He clearly didn't expect things to escalate so quickly. The tension was so thick, you could cut it with a knife. Everyone was on edge, ready for a fight to break out any second. Gillian stared down at the young master, his expression unreadable. He admitted that he knew who the young master was. Belinda stepped forward, her face etched with concern. She warned the young master to stand back, saying that Gillian wasn't in his right mind. Gillian declared that he knew the cure to the eternal punishment. He spoke about the incurable illness that the young master's daughter was suffering from. The group listened intently to what Gillian had to say. The young master stared at Gillian, his blue eyes gleaming. He asked if that piqued Gillian's interest, not breaking eye contact. The disease was brutal, a high fever, coughing up blood, and red spots blooming like flower petals on the skin. It sounded like a nightmare. They called it eternal punishment because the sight of the patient writhing in pain resembled a prisoner being tortured. It was pure hell. Gillian looked down at his battered hands and seemed to remember something terrible. He cried out Rachel's name in anguish. Ghislaine Perdium thought it wasn't too late to save Rachel. He remembered trying to find Gillian to recruit him, but turns out Gillian wasn't even alive by the time Ghislaine found him. He had given up on everything and ended his own life as soon as his daughter died. Ghislaine thought about the condition of Gillian's house. It was clear that all of his money had been spent trying to treat his daughter. All that was left were the weapons. Suddenly, a voice cried out in pain. It was Rachel, begging her dad to help her. She was suffering so much. She just wanted to die. Ghislaine knew there was no time to waste. He declared that he was going to start the treatment right then and there. But Belinda grabbed his arm, stopping him. She told the young master to go back. She didn't know what he was trying to do, but it wasn't something he could solve with just his power. She said it was a disease so bad that even priests couldn't cure it, and called it a punishment from the gods. She asked what he was going to do about it. Belinda insisted that he could fix Rachel. The young master looked away for a moment, lost in thought. He knew he could fix her. Ghislaine asked Belinda if she trusted him. Belinda looked at him, her expression filled with worry. She didn't know if she could put her faith in him. Belinda handed him a list. She told the young master to purchase all the medicinal herbs on that list and come back. She was putting a lot of trust in him. Belinda stared at the list, her face unreadable. The young master knew that for wandering mercenaries without a home, knowledge was directly tied to survival. Ghislaine thought about eternal punishment. Although it was an incurable disease right now, a cure would be discovered in the future. It became quite a hot topic back then, especially since the method was relatively simple. He remembered it clearly, but the only problem was the super high cost of the ingredients. Ghislaine stared at the fairy's blessing. It was absolutely vital for the cure. The recipe was complex. It said to finely chop the fairy's blessing and the herbs, pack them tightly into a bottle, and fill it with alcohol. Then, he had to shake it well to mix it thoroughly and let it sit for a while before adding the remaining ingredients and stirring. Gillian held up the finished bottle. He told the young master to have her drink it. Gillian gently held Rachel, his expression full of hope. He carefully tilted the bottle and poured the medicine into her mouth. Rachel lay there, still suffering. Blood stained her face and clothes, and her eyes were filled with pain. Rachel remained still, her face pale and peaceful. It was impossible to tell if the medicine was working or not. The three of them waited, holding their breath. The room was so quiet, you could hear a pin drop. Gillian's eyes widened. He stammered, noticing that the the red spots were fading away. He was shocked, saying that the medicine actually worked. Gillian looked absolutely stunned. He asked how Ghislaine had done it, since not even divine power could cure her. Ghislaine explained that the priest's divine power wasn't all-powerful. He said it only enhanced the body's vitality, strengthening a person's own abilities to overcome the illness, which was different from a fundamental cure. Gillian then asked if his daughter could really be cured. Ghislaine stared intently, promising that in just a couple of months, he guaranteed Rachel would be completely cured. He sounded confident, like there was no doubt in his mind. Gillian slowly lowered himself to his knees, his head bowed in what looked like total defeat. The old man seemed to be giving up completely. Gillian asked what Ghislaine wanted from him, since he'd come all the way to find him. He said all he had left was his useless body, and if Ghislaine needed him to be his dog or his slave, he would do it without question. Ghislaine told him that he didn't need a slave. What he needed was Gillian, the captain of the Ratatosk mercenaries. He was there for a soldier, not a servant. Gillian's eyes widened as he stared at Ghislaine. He thought to himself that he recognized those eyes. They were the eyes of a dreamer, someone chasing something impossible. Someone grabbed Gillian's long, white hair and yanked his head up. It looked like a painful way to get his attention. The attacker kept a tight grip on Gillian's hair, holding his head still. Then he raised a massive axe, the blade glinting in the light as he prepared to strike. Back with Ghislaine, he stood surrounded by his people, calm and collected. Meanwhile, Gillian was completely stunned, realizing something he couldn't believe. He muttered, "How could it be?" Gillian's eyes were wide with shock as he stared at Ghislaine. He thought to himself that Ghislaine was completely different from what he remembered. Ghislaine stared down at Gillian, his expression serious. He asked if there was anyone else besides those already present who had come with him or might come looking for him. Ghislaine asked if Gillian had anyone who held a grudge against him. Gillian admitted that he did, and he figured there would be more in the future. In that case, a sudden burst of blue energy tore through the room. Gillian dove out of the way, barely avoiding the energy that would have blasted him to bits, but the attack was too fast. The energy slammed into Gillian, sending him flying. Gillian groaned, completely confused by what had just happened. He didn't understand why he was suddenly under attack. The attacker grabbed Gillian by the neck, choking him. He demanded to know who had sent him. The attacker was shocked. He stammered, not understanding how Ghislaine knew. Ghislaine realized he could already tell who was behind the attack. Ghislaine drew his sword, looking serious. He said that he didn't want to use his blade, but it looked like he had no choice. Gillian asked Ghislaine to let him take care of the attacker. He looked determined to resolve this himself. The air was filled with the sound of rushing wind. It was over as quickly as it started. Belinda watched as Gillian showed no hesitation in killing the attacker. She thought to herself, wondering why young Master Ghislaine Perdium would recruit such a dangerous person. She couldn't shake the feeling that this might be a mistake. Deep in the forest, a small wooden house stood on stilts, but the peaceful appearance hid a dark reality. A reconnaissance unit had been killed. Inside a dark room, several cloaked figures were whispering to each other. One of them shouted, asking what had happened. He told them to be quiet, looking absolutely furious. The leader, Viego of the Wildcat Traffickers, told them to lower their voices. He then apologized to the captain, trying to calm the situation down. One of the figures pointed out that, according to their intel, Ghislaine Perdium shouldn't even be able to find a reconnaissance unit, let alone take them out. He wondered if the unit was incompetent, or if their intel was just plain wrong. He stammered nervously, and then revealed that Gillian had joined Ghislaine's group. Another figure asked if that was true, sounding surprised. The first figure confirmed it, saying that he had seen it with his own eyes. He seemed shocked. The cloaked figure stared down at Gillian, his eyes burning with hatred. He announced that Gillian was finally starting to make a move, and that he was his former captain. The horses galloped through the forest, pulling the carriage as fast as they could. The trees blurred by in a rush of green and brown. Belinda was getting annoyed. She complained that it was suffocating in there, and wondered if that guy was an arms dealer, since he brought so much stuff. She figured they only needed a sword or two, but at least they bought another carriage to bring Rachel comfortably. Ghislaine explained that the rear guard, Fergus and Ricardo, had in use for all of that stuff. He told her to bear with it for now. The carriage continued to speed through the forest as rain started to fall. The most important thing at hand was to escape this rift. Belinda asked Ghislaine if the watcher they had caught was sent by Lady Amelia. Ghislaine agreed that it was almost certainly her doing. Ghislaine realized this could be trouble. Belinda explained that the mask the watcher was wearing was a symbol used by the Wildcat Traffickers, a powerful guild in Rayfold. The Wildcat Traffickers, huh? Ghislaine wondered. Belinda continued, explaining that their main trade was swindling, assassination, drugs, human trafficking, and more. They were filthy scum who took on all the vile work. She added that many skilled former mercenaries were among them, making them a shadowy guild armed with combat power. Ghislaine was surprised. He asked Belinda how she knew all that when all she did was stay in the castle. Belinda replied that she just heard a lot of things before she started working there. Belinda warned Ghislaine that, in any case, they're persistent, so he should be careful. Belinda looked at Ghislaine with determination. She told him it'd be fine, that they could handle whatever came next. Ghislaine glanced up at Jillian, a hint of a smile on his face. He stated that everything would be all right because they had Jillian on their side. The carriages sped away as fast as they could, the horses kicking up dust and dirt behind them. They needed to get away, and fast. Gillian moved with incredible speed, his sword a blur of silver. He was a whirlwind of destruction, cutting down anyone who dared to stand in his way. Gillian blocked a blow with ease, his eyes scanning the area. He realized it was an ambush from the ground, and they were surrounded. Gillian didn't even see it coming. The assassin lunged at him with a knife, aiming for a fatal blow. But Gillian was too quick, deflecting the attack just in time. The assassin's grip tightened around the knife, ready to strike again. He was determined to finish the job, no matter what it took. Gillian didn't hesitate. He struck back with incredible force, catching the assassin off guard. Blood splattered as the assassin went down. Gillian looked up, his eyes widening in surprise. He realized they had walked right into a trap, and it was too late to turn back now. Gillian realized it was a trap. At this rate, they'd be crushed. The enemies were closing in fast, and there was nowhere to run. It was an ambush, just as Ghislaine had figured. He wasn't surprised in the slightest. The ambushers were on them in seconds, swords raised high. They were ready to cut them to pieces. Someone shouted, calling Jillian, the former captain of the Ratatosk mercenaries. Jillian's face tightened. The voice went on, accusing Jillian of being a coward. It claimed he disbanded his entire group of mercenaries just because of his daughter. Jillian denied everything. He said he didn't know what the guy was talking about and asked if he'd gotten so old he couldn't even remember his former peer. The cloaked figure scoffed, asking if Jillian was playing dumb. The figure promised to make Jillian remember him. The cloaked figure shouted for his men to kill them. Ghislaine asked if Jillian needed help, but the cloaked figure waved him off. He said he had some unfinished business with Jillian. Ghislaine said that he should be fine on his own. Gillian stood ready to fight. His eyes narrowed. Gillian swung his axe, cutting down the attackers with ease. His movements were quick and deadly. The cloaked figure looked shocked by Gillian's power. He yelled, cursing the old man. Gillian didn't hold back. He swung his axe in a wide arc, taking down multiple attackers at once. The force of his blows sent blood flying everywhere. Gillian kept up the pressure, not giving his enemies any room to breathe. Each swing of his axe was precise and deadly, leaving a trail of bodies in its wake. The cloaked figure realized Gillian was just as strong as he used to be. He ordered his troops to split into two groups, trying to attack Gillian from both sides at once. Gillian just scoffed at their attempt to surround him. He mounted a horse, ready to charge straight through their lines. The cloaked figures looked completely stunned. They hadn't expected Gillian to have a horse. Gillian lowered his head and charged right at them. Gillian lowered his head and charged straight through the enemy ranks. He was like a storm of steel and fury, cutting down anyone who dared to stand in his path. The cloaked figure couldn't get near Gillian. He yelled at his troops, ordering them to aim at the horse. He was getting desperate. Suddenly, Gillian was struck. An enemy blade found its mark, piercing his side. He was thrown from his horse, landing hard on the ground. Gillian was surrounded. They closed in, their weapons raised, ready to finish him off. He was trapped, with no way out. Even on the ground, Gillian wasn't giving up. He swung his axe, a whirlwind of steel, trying to keep the attackers at bay. He wasn't going down without a fight. The attacker snarled down at Gillian, warning him that since he had ruined his life, he shouldn't get in the way of his work. The attacker raised a clawed hand, promising that he would make sure to kill Gillian. He looked absolutely furious. The attacker stumbled backwards, losing his balance. He was clearly in shock, not expecting to be overpowered so easily. Gillian stood tall, his axe dripping with blood. He stared down at the attacker, who was lying defeated at his feet. Gillian declared that he was no longer the captain of the Ratatosk mercenaries, denying his past. He looked determined to leave that life behind. The attacker was sent flying backwards through the air, completely defeated. His shield clattered to the ground as he fell, his body aching. The attacker was on his knees, yelling that Gillian was lying about his past. He demanded to know who Gillian really was if he wasn't the captain. Gillian held his axe firmly, stating that he had discarded his past. He declared that he was now nothing but young Lord Ghislaine's subordinate. The attacker looked absolutely furious, his eyes burning with rage. He screamed that he would kill Gillian no matter what it took. The clash of steel echoed boomed through the air as the two warriors fought with blinding speed. Each strike was met with another, the force of their blows tearing up the ground around them. It was a dance of death, and neither was willing to give an inch. The attacker, consumed by rage, screamed that the mercenary company was disbanded after Jillian left. He accused Jillian of robbing him of his purpose, forcing him to live a disgraceful life just to survive. He looked absolutely furious. Jillian, despite the attacker's words, continued to fight. He moved with incredible speed, dodging blows and deflecting attacks from all sides. He was determined to protect Gillen, no matter the cost. He spun, his axe a blur of motion, deflecting another blow. Gillian's face was grim. His eyes narrowed as he focused on the fight. He wouldn't let them pass, not while Ghislaine was still in danger. The attacker, still on the ground, yelled about the shield. He declared that he was prepared to sacrifice his entire life to the Ratatosk mercenaries, the best in history. His voice was filled with a mix of anger and despair. The cloaked man glared at Jillian, asking if he had thrown everything away to become a pawn for a spoiled noble. The ground around them was littered with bodies. The cloaked man's face contorted with rage, his one visible eye burning with hatred. He screamed that he couldn't forgive Jillian for what he had done. The cloaked man didn't wait for a response. He lunged forward, blue blades flashing as he attacked Jillian with incredible speed. Jillian barely had time to react. He raised his axe, the metal screaming as he blocked the cloaked man's attack. The force of the blow shook him to his core. The cloaked man pressed his attack, not giving Jillian any room to breathe. Each strike was faster and more powerful than the last, forcing Jillian to struggle to keep up. The cloaked man sneered, reminding Jillian that his strength was from years ago when he was still the captain. Meanwhile, Jillian struggled to defend himself against the barrage of attacks. The cloaked man pressed his attack, saying that while Jillian was wasting his time trying to cure his daughter, he was putting himself through countless battles to get stronger. The force of his strikes sent sparks flying. The cloaked man continued his assault, declaring that Jillian was no longer a match for him. Jillian gritted his teeth as he barely managed to block another strike, the impact jarring his arms. Jillian's face was contorted in a grimace as he struggled to hold his ground. The cloaked man's relentless attacks were pushing him to his limit. With a final, powerful blow, the cloaked man sent Jillian flying backwards. Jillian crashed to the ground, the wind knocked out of him. The cloaked man stood over Jillian, his voice echoing with triumph. He declared that it was over for Jillian right there. The cloaked man's hand began to glow with an intense blue light. The mana crackled around him, ready to strike. Jillian, struggling to stand, looked at the cloaked figure. He asked if all this was because of his vengeance. The cloaked man looked shocked as Jillian grabbed his dagger. He wondered if Jillian had been hiding his true power until now. Suddenly, Jillian unleashed a massive blast of energy. The force sent the cloaked man flying backwards. Jillian looked up at the cloaked figure, trying to understand. He asked why the cloaked figure hadn't tried to get revenge earlier, if that was the goal. The cloaked figure laughed, a cruel sound that echoed through the forest. He told Jillian that he knew one thing, but not the other, enjoying the old man's confusion. The cloaked figure continued, explaining that he had already visited where Jillian used to live. The hunt had been long. The cloaked figure spat out that there was no sign of the Ratatosk mercenaries. All that was left was a feeble old man, not even worth killing. He wondered where the Jillian he used to look up to had disappeared to. Jillian stared back, his eyes hardening with resolve. He commanded the cloaked figure to raise his weapon, ready to fight despite his age. Jillian stared at the sword in his hand, his grip tightening. He thought to himself that he, too, was just a body forced to do someone else's bidding, but at least, for this moment, he could choose his own path. Jillian raised his weapons high, the steel glinting in the dim light. He declared that he would show his former comrade the highest level of respect he could possibly give. Jillian's eyes narrowed, his face hardening with determination. He announced that he would fight as the captain of the Ratatosk mercenaries once more. Yes, he would. The cloaked figure smirked, finally seeing the Jillian he remembered. Steel clashed against steel as Jillian and the cloaked figure engaged in a furious battle. Now they were talking. The cloaked figure's face twisted into a wide, bloodthirsty grin. That was exactly what he had wished for, he thought, relishing the chance to finally test his strength against the legendary Jillian. Jillian and the cloaked figure traded blows, each strike carrying enough force to shatter stone. Energy crackled around them as they weaved and dodged, trying to find an opening. Jillian swung his axe in a wide arc, aiming to cleave the cloaked figure in two. But the cloaked figure was ready, intercepting the blow with a swift parry. The cloaked figure struck back with a speed that belied his size, hitting Jillian hard. The force of the blow sent Jillian staggering back, his face contorted in pain. Up close, the cloaked figure's face was a mess of blood and bruises. But despite the pain, a crazy grin stretched across his lips. Jillian raised his axe high above his head, ready to deliver the final blow. He was going to end this right here. Diego Villanos, his face a brutal mess, was barely conscious. He was going to remember Jillian, the former captain of the Ratatosk mercenaries, for doing this to him. Diego Villanos lay defeated, his blood staining the ground around him. He was breathing hard, each gasp a struggle. The brutal sword lay discarded near a fallen soldier. The ground was littered with the bodies of the dead, a grim reminder of the battle that had just taken place. Gillian stood tall over the carnage, his armor stained with the blood of his enemies. He had won this fight, but at what cost? Gillian turned to his men. "Good work," he said. "Oh my, selling these guys loot could bring in quite a bit of money, don't you think?" Ghislaine apologized, saying he'd caused more delays than necessary. "No, it's fine," Gillian replied, accepting the apology. Ghislaine thought that Gillian was far more exceptional than he'd expected. When Ghislaine had first left home to start mercenary work, the stories about Gillian from his seniors had helped lay the foundation for him to become the mercenary king. He was glad that moving quickly had been the right choice, because thanks to that, he'd gained a reliable comrade. Ghislaine wondered if Gillian remembered who he was back then. Gillian simply replied, yes. Gillian said that Ghislaine had been his old comrade. Ghislaine wondered what his old comrades were doing now. He figured they were living a life of their own, since this was before they had met him. Ghislaine thought to himself that he would have to scout them out someday. He looked off into the distance, planning his next move. Ghislaine suggested that they follow Belinda's idea and grab anything valuable from the fallen enemies. Gillian immediately shot back, reminding him that he wasn't his subordinate. 2 days later, they arrived in Perdium territory. The wagon trundled along the worn path, carrying them closer to their destination. The land was rough, showing signs of recent battles, but the castle in the distance offered a beacon of hope. Ghislaine leaned forward, asking if that was Perdium up ahead. Gillian confirmed that it was, indeed, their destination. Ghislaine said that it felt good to be back home, remembering how he'd run away, thinking he could return anytime he wanted. He then asked Gillian what he thought of their land. Gillian paused for a moment before replying that it was great. Gillian looked over at Ghislaine, his expression grim. He said that their land was shitty, wasn't it? Gillian went on, pointing out that all the houses were falling apart, and fixing them was impossible. He added that the fields were empty because all the farmers had been forced to join the army, which meant the land couldn't grow anything. He sounded like he knew this land's problems really well. Ghislaine declared that he was going to fix all those problems. He said that's why he needed Gillian's strength, adding that it would be a long battle to get rid of everything tied to Duke Delphine, and to protect what they had taken for granted. Ghislaine looked absolutely determined. He vowed that he would revive this land, no matter what it took. The carriage rolled along the road, carrying them closer to their goal. The journey ahead would be long, but they were ready to face whatever came next. Belinda suddenly pointed, exclaiming for the young master to look over there. Ghislaine looked in the direction she was pointing, wondering what was so important. Ghislaine's eyes widened as he stared intently at something in the distance. He seemed to recognize something, his expression shifting from curiosity to shock. Ghislaine stared up at the silhouette in disbelief. He whispered in shock, recognizing the figure standing before him, asking if it was his father. Perdium Castle loomed in the distance, a reminder of the challenges and responsibilities that awaited. The massive structure stood as a symbol of his family's legacy and the land he was determined to restore. Inside the castle, a tense meeting was underway. The leaders were discussing the need to reduce their forces, which caused immediate concern among the group, with one of them questioning how they were going to properly manage the front lines. The explanation was that they needed to rebuild the forts and defense weapons that had been damaged during the last battle against the orcs. Even reducing the night forces was barely enough to give them some breathing room, but one of them still thought reducing the forces posed a significant risk. Perdium Knight, Captain Randolph, Treasurer Albert, and Perdium General Administrator Homern were present at the meeting. Suddenly, a voice echoed through the room, asking how long it had been. Ghislaine thought to himself that as the young lord of Perdium, it had only been a few months, but as the mercenary king, it had been several decades. Then, someone spoke. welcoming him back. Ghislaine saw his father, Count Perdium Zwalter Perdium, standing before him. He hadn't seen him in a while, and it was kind of a shock. Ghislaine remembered that as a kid, he never really liked his father because he was always so strict and serious. But now, he was starting to understand things better. The countless burdens of exhaustion and fatigue seemed to weigh heavily on Zwalter's shoulders. He realized the heavy responsibility his father carried as the lord of this land. Zwalter spoke up, mentioning he had heard that Ghislaine had been away from the castle for about a week. He took a sip of his tea, waiting for an answer. Ghislaine responded that he had visited the Rayfolds. He didn't offer any other details, keeping his explanation short and to the point. Zwalter Perdium asked Ghislaine if he had caused any trouble while he was away. He had also heard that Ghislaine won a duel against Cain, and even won some money. The Count asked suspiciously if he dared to gamble. Ghislaine simply denied it. Ghislaine scoffed at the idea of gambling, calling it an investment. He clarified that he didn't gamble, and he just had business with Amelia. Zwalter Perdium reminded Ghislaine that he would be succeeding Perdium, so he needed to think before he acted. Ghislaine said he understood and told him not to worry about it. Zwalter, annoyed, thought to himself how he couldn't help but worry about his son. Ghislaine said that he had heard that Zwalter had made some noisy trouble while he was away. He asked if it was true that he executed James and Philip for trying to sell Elena away. He looked at his father expectantly. One of the advisors chimed in, saying there was no way Ghislaine executed them himself. He suggested that they probably fought against each other, and the story got exaggerated, while Ghislaine merely delivered the final blow. Ghislaine thought to himself that despite the knights being traitors, the fact that he killed Knight Captain Randolph's men probably didn't sit well with him. He figured it was best to avoid trouble. Zwalter Perdium listened to his son, but he didn't believe a word of it. Zwalter simply said something. Ghislaine's eyes widened slightly. Ghislaine thought to himself that no matter the process, what was important was that Elena was alive. He realized it was the first compliment he had ever gotten from his father. Ghislaine looked at his father and asked if he could request one thing. Zwalter looked back at his son, curious about what he wanted. One of the advisors interrupted, saying that if the young lord was about to ask for money as a reward, he was going to cut him off right there. He told him to think about all the trouble he had caused so far, like selling military provisions to get gambling money, lighting the front gate on fire to sell an army horse, and melting all the armor to forge a legendary sword or something. Ghislaine just shrugged, admitting it sure sounded like a lot. Ghislaine asked his father and the others to just give him permission. Permission for what? He wanted to pioneer the forest of beasts. Ghislaine stared forward, his eyes locked on some distant goal. He was determined to make them understand. Ghislaine's face tightened. His dad said no. Ghislaine explained that his dad freaked out and started shouting at him. Of course he would. That place was filled with monsters and had nothing to gain. Ghislaine then turned to Billion, asking if he had heard of his plan from Belinda. Billion confirmed, adding that he reckoned Ghislaine wanted to pioneer the Rock of Bezel with the funds he received from the Rayold's daughter, the Forest of Death, from which no one could return alive. Because of that, nothing was known about the place, and everyone avoided it. Its notoriety was already well known in other regions as well. Ghislaine knew about it well. As they said, there was nothing to gain from entering that place. Belinda was not happy. She asked if they should get started, then yelled at Ghislaine, asking if he was really going to go ahead without permission. Gillian watched the scene unfold, his expression unreadable. Belinda asked what could possibly be in that forest that he was so obsessed with. Ghislaine said he'd tell her later. If he revealed it now, the news would spread and cause trouble. He added that he should really pioneer the forest with the power of a man-made god. Ghislaine explained that not too far from the forest's entrance, there was something special. A massive runestone vein was buried there. It was ore infused with mana. Runestone, he continued, was an extremely rare mineral that mages were absolutely crazy about. It was used in all sorts of magical tools, barriers, magic circles, magic scrolls, alchemy, and magic research. Basically, anything that used mana. Ghislaine smirked. In his previous life, Duke Delph was the one who discovered it, but now only he knew about this piece of information. He wouldn't let the same mistake happen again. Belinda looked really annoyed. She clearly still wasn't happy about this whole plan. Belinda sighed, knowing she had no choice. She agreed to follow his orders, since he must have a plan. Ghislaine then told her to head to the nearby guild and hire some mercenaries. Around 200 should do. Belinda couldn't help but point out that he was really going all out with the money he'd risked his life to get. Gillian asked if the young lord was sure about this. Mercenaries were a rough and unruly bunch, and with that many gathered, they'd be hard to control. They might even turn on their employers and take everything everything for themselves. Ghislaine agreed, which was why he and Jillian were going to pick out the useful ones personally. Gillian asked what Ghislaine meant by that. Ghislaine explained that he was talking about the most skilled among the small-scale mercenary groups in the north. Gillian's eyes widened. "Don't tell me," he said. "Those crazy dogs." Ghislaine confirmed. They were skilled enough, but their power would turn to dust if things went south. The Cerberus mercenaries. A vision of the mercenaries appeared, showing a pack of monstrous wolves. Ghislaine declared that it was time to go put a leash on those crazy dogs. They began their journey towards the Cerberus mercenaries' territory, ready to face whatever awaited them. The outskirts of the Zimbar territory was home to the Cerberus mercenaries. Their camp was a chaotic mess, filled with rough-looking characters. Ghislaine and Jillian approached the camp on horseback. Dust kicked up around them as they made their way closer to the Cerberus mercenaries. Two mercenaries spotted Ghislaine and Gillian. They commented that the two were here and that those poor souls had no idea what they were walking into. The mercenary judged from his appearance that Ghislaine looked like some noble brat. He figured they could make so much money off of him. Suddenly, Gillian attacked the mercenaries. They were caught completely off guard, not expecting such a sudden assault. What the heck was going on? The mercenary screamed in pain, cursing Gillian. He was clearly not prepared for such a brutal attack. What was Gillian doing? Gillian didn't stop. He swung his sword around, hitting multiple mercenaries. The force of his attacks sent them flying. The remaining mercenaries finally snapped out of their shock and prepared for battle. They demanded to know who the heck Gillian was and why he was attacking them. Had he lost his mind? One of the mercenaries spoke directly to Ghislaine, judging him by his noble appearance. He warned him that he couldn't act so recklessly just because of his status. It didn't work that way here. The mercenary leader stared down at the group with cold eyes. He told them not to expect to return home alive. He looked absolutely serious. Ghislaine rode towards the castle, the wind whipping through his hair. He looked determined to face whatever awaited him. The horse galloped forward, kicking up dust. Ghislaine scowled, his blue eyes flashing with irritation. He ordered them to shut their mouths and bring him their captain. He wasn't messing around. The mercenary leader chuckled, looking down at Ghislaine with disdain. He thought the noble brat had lost his mind. He really seemed to think so. The mercenary leader swung the massive chain around with ease. He declared that it was time for Ghislaine to learn what it meant to take responsibility for his actions. He looked absolutely serious. The chain came crashing down with incredible force. Ghislaine braced himself for the impact. The air crackled with raw power. Ghislaine managed to raise his sword just in time. He blocked the chain, sparks flying as the metal clashed against metal. The force of the blow still shook him. The mercenaries watched in disbelief. Ghislaine had just shoved his blade directly into the chain. What the heck was he trying to do? The chain slammed into the ground with a bone-shattering impact. Ghislaine realized that talking wasn't going to get him anywhere with these guys. They just wanted to fight. Ghislaine turned to Gillian and told him to hold back. He ordered Jillian to beat them up, but not to kill them. Jillian moved with incredible speed, his sword a blur of motion. The mercenary barely had time to react before Jillian's blade slammed into his own, sending shockwaves through his arms. The force of Gillian's attack sent the mercenary flying backwards. The mercenary crashed into the ground, groaning in pain. The remaining mercenaries charged at Gillian, furious. They yelled that they wouldn't go easy on him just because he was a noble. The battle raged on, a whirlwind of steel and fury. Each strike echoed with the force of colliding metal, the air thick with the smell of ozone and the promise of blood. Gillian was still holding his own against the mercenaries. The ground around them was torn up from the force of their blows. The mercenaries stood their ground, spears at the ready. Their eyes showed a mix of fear and determination, knowing they were outmatched, but refusing to back down. Ghislaine stood there with Gillian, looking annoyed. He demanded to know how long they planned on making them wait. Ghislaine's expression hardened. He told the mercenaries to scram and bring him their captain. The man was just waking up, clearly annoyed. He wondered what all the noise was about. Below, a large group of soldiers stood ready. Kaor, the captain of the Cerberus mercenaries, finally appeared. He demanded to know why Ghislaine was looking for him. Ghislaine responded that he was there to entrust a request to Kaor. He admitted this whole attack was his way of greeting him, saying he thought it was the best way to tame him. Kaor looked at him suspiciously. He said he couldn't imagine what would happen if Ghislaine were to greet them a second time. Kaor sighed and told Ghislaine to cut to the chase. He wanted to know what kind of request he had. Ghislaine told Kaor he wanted to hire him to pioneer the forest of beasts. Kaor looked surprised and asked if he meant the forest near the Perdelium territory. Kaor wanted to know what kind of person would stir up such a dangerous forest. Ghislaine introduced himself as Ghislain Perdium, the young lord of Peridium. Kayor sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable. He seemed to be thinking hard about what Ghislain had just said. Kayor scoffed, asking if Ghislain was the young lord from the rumors. He said Ghislain must be out of his mind. He told Ghislain that growing up in a greenhouse meant he didn't know what the world was really like, and that the forest wasn't a place for a rookie like him. He said he didn't need to hear any more from him. Kayor announced that the negotiation was over. The surrounding mercenaries tensed, ready for action. Ghislain sat with Gillian, his gaze intense as he stared at Kayor. He taunted Kayor, asking if he was scared. Ghislain continued to mock Kayor, saying he had heard the mercenaries were skilled, but it seemed like a hoax. He looked absolutely sure of himself. Suddenly, one of the mercenaries was sent crashing to the floor. The sound of the impact echoed through the room. Kayor stood over the fallen mercenary, looking down at Ghislain. He warned Ghislain not to mess with him, saying they were mercenaries who only did things that paid off. He added that only weaklings made excuses. Kayor announced that the mood was ruined. He said he had been trying to play along, but Ghislain was just throwing around pathetic provocations. He dismissed Ghislain as a clueless brat, not even worth killing, and demanded money for the trouble before telling him to get lost. Ghislain refused to back down. He was absolutely sure of himself. He said something, his voice firm. Ghislain looked directly at Kayor, his blue eyes piercing. He announced that he, Ghislain Peridium, was requesting a Moriana's recognition against Kayor, the captain of the Cerberus mercenaries. Kayor raised an eyebrow, looking at Ghislain suspiciously. He asked if Ghislain even knew what that was. Ghislain smirked, confirming that of course he did. The system began to explain the rules of Moriana's recognition. It was described as a traditional betting method passed down among mercenaries. When two people agreed to the bet, they would fight using only a single dagger without relying on mana, with each of them having one of their arms tied together. The system continued, warning that stepping outside the small circle also counted as a loss. This forced them into a brutal life or death struggle within limited space and movement. It was explained that in many cases, not only the loser, but even the victor ended up dead. The system continued to explain the rules of Moriana's recognition. The loser had to cleanly admit defeat and completely obey the winner's orders. The loser would become the winner's dog, forced to do whatever he was told. Ghislain asked if that sounded good. Kayor looked at him suspiciously, wondering how a noble like Ghislain knew about such a dirty mercenary tradition. He explained that in the mercenary world, refusing the challenge would be admitting weakness, something that could never happen. Ghislain just smirked, surrounded by Kayor's mercenaries. The tension in the room was so thick, you could cut it with a knife. Something was about to happen. Kayor grinned and called out to his men. He told them they had a bold little noble who wanted to be recognized in a mercenary's way. He asked why they didn't help him out a little. Ghislain and Kayor stood facing each other, their hands tied together. Each held a knife, ready to fight. The mercenaries watched closely, waiting for the signal. One of Kayor's mercenaries yelled that Ghislain was an insolent little noble brat and ordered Kayor to kill him. Ghislain and Kayor stood there, hands tied, ready to begin the brutal mercenary ritual. Ghislain knew that he couldn't back down now. Ghislain smirked, staring directly at Kayor. He told him that he'd already done this 5 times. He looked completely confident. Kayor looked at Ghislain with a surprised look on his face. He wondered what Ghislain meant when he said 5 times. Ghislain stared at Kayor, a smirk on his face. He corrected himself, saying that he'd actually done this over 100 times. He was ready. The word start flashed between them, and the duel began. Ghislain stared intently at Kayor, his blue eyes focused. Ghislain and Kayor immediately clashed, their daggers meeting with a sharp clang. They moved with incredible speed, each trying to find an opening. The fight became a blur of steel and sweat as Ghislain and Kayor exchanged blows. Each parry and thrust was met with equal force. Ghislain dodged a thrust from Kayor's dagger, the blade whistling past his ear. He quickly countered with a strike of his own, aiming for Kayor's exposed side. Kayor managed to block Ghislain's attack at the last second, the impact sending a jolt up his arm. He knew that Ghislain was stronger than he looked, but he wasn't giving up yet. Ghislain and Kayor traded blows, each strike carrying the weight of their pride. Kayor's attacks came hard and fast, pushing Ghislain back. Kayor kept up the pressure, his dagger a blur as he aimed for vital points. Ghislain struggled to defend, each block sending pain through his arms. Ghislain crashed to the ground, the impact jarring his senses. He looked up at Kayor, who stood over him, a smirk playing on his lips. Kayor looked down at Ghislain and chuckled, telling him that he was actually holding on longer than he expected. He went on, asking how Ghislain could claim to have completed Moriana's recognition 100 times, something most people struggled with even once. Kayor Kayor said that if Ghislaine was going to lie, he needed to try harder to make it believable. One of Kayor's allies yelled that the noble brat had somehow lost the momentum. He ordered Kayor to kill Ghislaine, saying that this was what he got for messing with him. Gillian looked furious, his eyes burning with rage. He let out a yell as he and his knights prepared for battle. Gillian stared intensely, his face grim. He knew it was a losing battle. The situation was dire for Ghislaine. The small circle barely allowed room to move, and the rules forbade mana, forcing them to rely on physical strength alone. Meanwhile, Kayor had every chance to take control and dominate the fight. The text went on, saying that if the situation became truly dire, Ghislaine and Kayor exchanged blows, their movements quick and deadly. The intensity of the fight was rising, but Ghislaine looked like he was barely holding on. Kayor attacked, his foot connecting hard with Ghislaine's face. The force of the blow sent shockwaves through Ghislaine's body. He could feel the pain blossoming in his cheek. Kayor watched Ghislaine, a cruel smile spreading across his face. He noticed the damage was stacking up because Ghislaine couldn't use mana for protection. He pointed out that Ghislaine was already looking pale and wondered if he was reaching his limit. Kayor continued his assault, sneering at Ghislaine for trying to resist his strength. He admitted that Ghislaine had insides, more than the other nobles he'd met, but that was all he was willing to give him. Kayor's eyes narrowed, his gaze piercing. He stared directly at Ghislaine, declaring that he could see right through him. Kayor went on, explaining that Ghislaine's strategy was to reflect or dodge the worst blows while enduring the less damaging ones. But because Moriana's recognition forbade the use of mana, the impacts were stacking up. He could see the strain building in Ghislaine's legs, plain as day on his face. Kayor's smile widened, a flash of teeth in the dim light. He wanted to see Ghislaine struggle. Kayor grinned, his eyes glowing with excitement. He declared that Ghislaine's struggle was what made this fun. The daggers flashed as Kayor and Ghislaine clashed. Each strike was met with a block, each parry a desperate attempt to gain an advantage. Kayor's dagger came down hard, but Ghislaine managed to deflect the blow at the last second. The force of the impact still rattled his bones. Ghislaine struggled to keep his footing as Kayor pressed his attack. He felt the sweat dripping down his face as he desperately tried to predict Kayor's next move. The daggers moved faster and faster as Ghislaine and Kayor traded blows. Each strike was aimed with deadly precision, but met with an equally skilled defense. Kayor grinned, a confident smirk spreading across his face. He announced that it was over. Kayor raised his dagger, his eyes filled with cold determination. He was about to end the fight, ready to strike the final blow. Suddenly, Gillian shouted in alarm, his voice filled with desperation. The soldiers around him reacted in shock. Ghislaine reversed the situation in a flash, his dagger piercing Kayor. The blade plunged deep, ending the fight. Kayor stared in disbelief. He couldn't believe Ghislaine had dodged his attack with such a strange stance. How was that even possible? Kayor didn't give Ghislaine a chance to recover. He launched a kick, putting all his strength into the attack. The force of the blow echoed through the air. Kayor winced in pain, blood trickling down his chest. But he wasn't about to give up, his eyes burning with determination. This fight was far from over. The two warriors clashed again, each blow carrying the weight of their pride and skill. Sparks flew as their daggers met, the sound of metal on metal ringing in the air. Neither was willing to yield an inch. The crowd erupted with shouts of encouragement for Kayor. They couldn't believe Ghislaine had managed to wound their captain again. One of the men yelled for Kayor to show him what a real mercenary was made of. Kayor lunged at Ghislaine, dagger aimed to strike. The force of the attack was intense, the air crackling with energy. It was a brutal display of power. Their daggers met with a resounding clash, each warrior determined to overpower the other. The sound of steel against steel echoed in the small space. It was a desperate struggle for dominance. Kayor stared at Ghislaine, his expression a mix of shock and disbelief. He couldn't understand what was happening. Kayor demanded. Gillian watched the fight intently, his eyes narrowed in thought. He was starting to understand what was happening. Gillian murmured. Gillian continued, analyzing Ghislaine's moves. Swinging with power stiffens the muscles and burdens the body with rigidity, he thought. The young lord didn't fight against the opponent's momentum. Instead, he relaxed and redirected it to create his own flow. It was a brilliant strategy to overcome the disadvantage of size. Kayor was in bad shape, covered in cuts and bruises. The other soldiers looked at him, worried. They didn't think he was making anyone laugh in his current state. Kayor acknowledged Ghislaine's impressive resolve. He said that most people would have broken the rules and used mana when cornered. Kayor admitted that he liked Ghislaine's style and that he had won the position of captain through this method. Kayor looked at Ghislaine and admitted that he might be at a slight disadvantage in a head-to-head match, but he had a plan. He grinned, confident confident in his next move. Kayor's face was stern, his eyes focused. He declared that the conditions for victory weren't limited to just overpowering his opponent. He had another trick up his sleeve. Kayor fell backward, his foot stepping outside the circle. That was it. Another rule of Moriana's recognition stated that if even one foot stepped outside the circle, it was an automatic loss. Kayor was sure of himself. No matter how skilled Ghislaine was, if Kayor sent him flying, he would have to touch the ground outside. Kayor was sure he would win. The dagger was held tight in his hand. The metal glinted, ready to strike. The air was thick with anticipation. Kayor and Ghislaine were still locked together, a desperate dance of strength and skill. But then, Kayor started to fall. He was losing his balance. Kayor was still falling, but he was not giving up. He strained against Ghislaine, trying to regain his footing. This was it, the turning point of the battle. Kayor's foot slipped. It was outside the circle. The fight was over. He had lost. Ghislaine had won. Ghislaine pressed his attack with everything he had. The dagger flashed in the light as he aimed for a weak spot, not giving Kayor any room to breathe. The punch landed hard, and Kayor went flying back. He could feel the force of the blow reverberating through his body. Kayor's foot slipped outside the circle. It was over. Ghislaine was breathing heavily, but he managed to say that he had won. Kayor was furious and asked him who the hell he was to have this caliber of skill. He added that he didn't like Ghislaine's attitude and reminded him that he was talking to his master. Ghislaine asked Kayor what he wanted, because the fight was over. He then said that Kayor hadn't gone outside the circle just yet, which made Kayor react in shock. Ghislaine looked ready to throw another punch. He was going to be disciplining his subordinate now, it seemed. Ghislaine stood over Kayor, who was sprawled on the ground. The surrounding crowd of onlookers was silent, watching the brutal end to the match. Kayor was bleeding from his face as he tried to argue. He stammered, saying that the rules stated that if one of the fighters stepped outside the circle, they lost. Ghislaine sneered and asked Kayor if he was going to follow the rules on the battlefield too. He told him not to talk back to his master. Kayor spat out that Ghislaine was a lunatic. He was clearly scared. Ghislaine didn't stop. He unleashed a brutal flurry of punches on Kayor, beating him without mercy. Some in the crowd were getting nervous. They wondered if it was okay to let Ghislaine keep going like this, since the bet was already over. But someone screamed for him to stop. Ghislaine didn't care what anyone thought. He told Kayor that he wasn't out of the circle yet, so the beating would continue. Ghislaine looked absolutely furious. He was lost in his own anger. The crowd started to panic. Someone yelled, asking if they were just going to watch this, and told them to kill Ghislaine. But then, a knight was cut down. Jillian raised his axe high. He warned everyone that anyone who got in the way of the young lord's disciplinary measure would be killed. Kayor was a mess. Blood dripped down his face, and his body was covered in cuts and bruises. He was clearly in a lot of pain. Ghislaine stared down at Kayor, a cold smile spreading across his face. He asked if he was done yet, enjoying his opponent's suffering. Ghislaine laughed, his fist raised high above Kayor's head. He was about to deliver another blow, not showing any mercy. The punch landed hard, sending Kayor flying through the air. The force of the impact echoed through the training grounds. Kayor lay on the ground, his mind racing. He thought about all the nobles he had met in his life, calling them nothing more than losers, overconfident pigs, traitors, and narcissists. Turns out, a little scare tactic worked wonders for them. They were groveling on the ground in no time. Ghislaine thought taking money from their pockets was truly entertaining, and that's how he earned the title of Mad Dog. Kayor lay on the ground, staring up at Ghislaine. He couldn't believe he was losing to a noble brat like this. The other mercenaries watched, terrified. They realized that Captain Kayor was going to die at this rate, but they didn't know what they could do. Ghislaine didn't even look at Kayor. He just told the others to bring him some water, a bandage, and a towel, adding that their captain was going to die at this rate, by the way. The knights seemed to understand what was going on. They were now ready to follow the young lord's commands. Below them, the world was vast and untamed. The old man held the mercenary's wrist tightly, showing his dominance. The unruly mercenaries were now listening to the young lord's orders. In the world of mercenaries, where fists were closer than the law, the young lord engraved his power into their heads using the most direct and surefire method. He showed them who was the boss. The image of a wolf bared its fangs, a symbol of raw power. Ghislaine showed them who the boss was. Kayor sat at the table, looking defeated. Two knights stood guard behind him, a constant reminder of his loss. Ghislaine pointed to the signature line on the contract, waiting for Kayor to seal the deal. The weight of the decision hung heavy in the air. Kayor tapped the table, then signed the contract. The sound echoed in the room. Ghislaine's eyes narrowed as he watched Kayor sign. He then grabbed Kaor's hand, saying he looked forward to working together, though it sounded forced. Ghislaine smiled, declaring that they were a family now and that he looked forward to working with him. The mercenaries looked on, unsure of what to make of the situation. A few days later, they were at the outskirts of the Perdium territory. The air was crisp and the landscape stretched out before them. The mercenaries grumbled, annoyed about being summoned so early. One of them yawned, complaining about having to eat lunch before starting work. They started gossiping, saying their employer was the perfidious young lord, and that he was just a brat who couldn't handle mercenaries. They figured it would be easy money. Someone clapped their hands to get everyone's attention. They agreed that to handle the young lord easily, they needed a representative. Someone asked if he was Gordon the Muscle. He grinned, confirming that he was. Gordon the Muscle said he had been watching them discuss how to get rewards without working hard. Gordon the Muscle explained that they needed to unite their voices to get what they wanted. He reminded them of a time when some dumbass made an insane demand and everything fell apart. He warned them that they needed to know their boundaries. Gordon the Muscle said he would pressure the employer as their representative, so they should put the compensation for his hard work in the bag. The mercenaries agreed that it sounded good and that Gordon should be their rep. They thought his giant build would help and that he was reliable, even though all he does is work out. The mercenaries looked up as one of them shouted that someone was coming. Gordon the Muscle gripped the bag of money tighter, ready to make his demands. Far from the mercenary camp, a lone rider approached a massive castle. The rider seemed determined, pushing onward towards his destination. The lone rider got closer, the castle now looming large in the distance. He urged his horse onward, undeterred by the size of the fortress. Back at the camp, the mercenaries watched the lone rider approach. One of them wondered if it was their employer, adding that he looked pitiful and might run away after seeing Gordon's muscles. Gordon the Muscle told the mercenaries to come forth and set up a scary mood for him. He grinned, ready to teach the brat how tough the real world was. A group of riders approached the camp, heading directly for the castle in the distance. They seemed to be moving with purpose, their destination clear. Leading the charge was Ghislaine Perdium, with a determined look on his face. Behind him rode a group of mercenaries, ready for action. Gordon the Muscle stared in disbelief. He recognized the dog snout-shaped helmets, and it hit him. These were the Cerberus mercenaries. He wondered what was going on. The Cerberus mercenaries rode into the camp, and Gordon was completely stunned. He couldn't believe what he was seeing, wondering what the hell Ghislaine had done to get those crazy dogs to follow him. Ghislaine approached Gordon and asked if he was the rep. Gordon, still caught off guard, stammered, confirming that he was indeed the representative. Ghislaine asked for his name, his blue eyes piercing. Gordon the Muscle, looking nervous, stammered as he gave his name. Ghislaine repeated the name, Gordon the Muscle. He seemed to be sizing him up. Gordon just waited, trying to read his expression. Ghislaine announced, "I am the young lord of Perdium, Ghislaine Perdium." He ordered Gordon to gather the mercenaries, his voice leaving no room for argument. Ghislaine declared their next move, his voice carrying over the camp. They would begin pioneering the Forest of Beasts, and he expected everyone to fall in line. The Forest of Beasts loomed ahead, its depths shrouded in mystery. The air was still, but there was a sense of unease hanging in the air. Ghislaine and Belinda walked towards the forest's edge. The mercenaries were already moving, preparing to enter the unknown. The text confirmed that all preparations for pioneering the forest were complete. Construction of the expedition's temporary base, resource procurement, everything was ready. The troops were assembled, a massive force ready to carve a path through the wilderness. They were a mix of contracted mercenaries and the young master's Cerberus forces. Belinda did the head count one more time, as requested. She confirmed that with the 146 mercenaries contracted through the office and the 41 Cerberus mercenaries brought by the young master, the total came to 192. The young master asked if Scoven had been informed. Belinda confirmed that he had, and that he was sleeping to avoid detection as they entered the Forest of Beasts. The young master seemed relieved, saying that was reassuring. The young master addressed the assembled mercenaries, his voice echoing in the air. He announced that they would be entering and pioneering the Forest of Beasts, a place rumored to be filled with unseen dangers. The young master continued, warning of monsters and threats beyond imagination that lurked within the forest. A mercenary interrupted, expressing his fear of venturing into such a dangerous place. Belinda snapped at him for daring to interrupt the young master. The young master offered a deal. Anyone who wished to withdraw could do so now, but if the mission succeeded, he promised them 3 times their current pay. He waited for their reaction. The mercenaries' eyes widened at the prospect of such a reward. One of them exclaimed that it sounded appealing. Belinda, however, looked annoyed and accused the young master of spouting nonsense, since they had already spent all their funds on preparations. He simply replied that this was how you boost morale. The young master was confident that he'd be able to pay the mercenaries and still have money left over if the mission succeeded. He was sure of it. The young master looked confident, as one of the mercenaries wondered how he would live up to his promise of paying them 3 times their current pay. Belinda, however, trusted the young master, believing that he always had a plan. The young master announced that it was time for the Forest of Beasts expedition team to move. Everyone looked ready to go. They ventured deeper into the forest. The trees grew tall and thick, blocking out most of the sunlight. It was a dark and mysterious place. The mercenaries started clearing a path through the forest. They swung their axes, cutting down trees and bushes, slowly making their way deeper into the unknown. Ghazlan stood atop the freshly felled tree, the axe still in his grip. The air was thick with the scent of freshly cut wood. The mercenaries worked together, their axes biting deep into the trunk of another massive tree. Each swing echoed through the forest as they continued to clear the path. Ghazlan looked up, a small smile playing on his lip. Ghazlan gestured forward, his voice ringing out with authority. He ordered them to keep clearing the path, cutting down trees, and loading the logs onto carts. Those without axes were told to dig around the stumps, making it easier to uproot the trees. Ghazlan thought about the Forest of Beasts development journal he'd gotten in his previous life, remembering how vast this place truly was. He knew that someday they'd drive out all the monsters and fully exploit the forest's resources. But right now, all he needed was money. He had to ignore everything else and secure the fastest route to the runestone vein. The young master stood firm, his sword reflecting the dim light. He knew that the wealth gained from this journey would be a huge help in stopping the conspiracy surrounding Perdium. The red-haired mercenary scoffed, muttering that the young master was just trying to show off his noble dignity. He figured the young master would give up soon enough, but he knew better than to say it out loud. He ordered them all to get back to work. Belinda looked at the young master with concern. She wondered why he was working alongside the mercenaries when he'd gone to the trouble of hiring them. She felt they were taking things lightly because he was doing the same work. The young master shrugged it off, saying it was fine. He figured the more hands they had, the quicker the job would get done. He didn't want to stay in this place any longer than they had to. Belinda sighed, saying he talked as if he knew everything already. One of the mercenaries yelled, asking if the other was trying to start a fight. So far, everything had been going smoothly, and he didn't want anyone messing it up. The young master watched calmly, ready to step in if things got out of hand. The young master thought about the Duchy of Delphine, who had conquered the kingdom and started building up the Forest of Beasts. He couldn't figure out why they picked that place. Instead, he managed to get a development journal that showed where the main resources were and what the monsters were like. Thanks to that, he felt somewhat ready, but he wondered what the employee was thinking, bringing hundreds of lanterns. He figured torches would have been a lot cheaper if they wanted to use them at night. The young master felt uneasy because nothing had happened so far. He'd only read about stuff in the journal and hadn't actually seen anything happen yet. He told everyone not to let their guard down. The forest was getting darker and deeper. The trees loomed over them. The mercenaries swung their axes, clearing a path through the dense trees. The sound of chopping wood echoed through the forest. One of the mercenaries wondered if it was already night, since it had gotten so much darker. He said that they said this was a dangerous forest, but they hadn't even seen a single monster. He figured it was all just a rumor, and they would have it easy without even having to do anything. He chuckled, saying he kind of felt sorry if they were getting paid triple for something easy like this. He then jokingly demanded his money back. The muscular mercenary raised an eyebrow, looking around at the others. He asked if they had all clearly chopped down countless trees on their way here. The other mercenaries looked at each other, a little confused by the question. They responded, confirming that they had. The muscular mercenary looked absolutely furious. He demanded to know why the path was still blocked if they had cleared so many trees. The mercenaries stared ahead, their faces grim. They clearly saw something that worried them. The young master's voice cut through the air, sharp and commanding. He told everyone to pay attention. One of the mercenaries looked around, his face etched with worry. He asked what was going on, wondering what had caused the sudden change in the air. The young master's voice echoed through the trees, warning Gordon that he was in mortal danger. He told him he would die if he stayed where he was. The young master told Gordon to come towards him slowly, one step at a time. Gordon responded, agreeing to follow his instructions. Gordon swung his makeshift weapon with all his might. The heavy log slammed into a tree with a loud crack. attack. Gordon was sent flying as the tree crashed down. The other mercenaries watched, their faces a mix of shock and concern. The mercenaries watched Gordon's display of strength with concern. One of them was furious, calling Gordon an idiot for his reckless actions. Gordon was sprawled on the ground, dazed and disoriented. The massive tree he'd brought down lay beside him, a testament to his brute strength, but also his lack of control. The young master frowned, sensing that something was off. He muttered that something wasn't right, his unease growing with each passing moment. The bald mercenary smirked, commenting on how easily scared their employer seemed to be. He gestured around, saying there was nothing to worry about and that the forest was just a bit dense. The young master's voice cut through the air, telling someone to come closer or they would die. He accused someone of trying to scare them, questioning if they thought he didn't know they were trying to intimidate them. The bald mercenary pointed forward, looking confused by what he was seeing. The young master's eyes narrowed, a sense of dread washing over him. Suddenly, the bald mercenary was sent flying through the air, completely caught off guard. He didn't even have time to scream as he tumbled downwards. The monster had no presence at all, making it impossible to predict how it would move. The bald mercenary was falling right into its trap. It was a being that you could only fall victim to if you were unaware. The monster was waiting for its next prey, unseen and unheard. The young master's eyes widened in alarm as he realized what it was. It was a direst ent. The forest was swarming with these giant monsters. They were surrounded, and the situation looked pretty grim. The creatures were huge, and there was nowhere to run. One of the soldiers screamed, seeing the monster right in front of him. He yelled about the monsters, his voice cracking with fear. More soldiers screamed, their faces contorted in fear. They were yelling that they were going to get eaten alive, begging everyone to run. One of the soldiers looked up, completely confused by what was happening. He didn't even have time to react before he was sent flying. The soldier was falling right into the monster's mouth. There was no way he could escape now. It was a terrifying sight. The Dirus Ents stood tall, their glowing red eyes piercing through the dim light of the forest. They were an absolutely terrifying sight, ready to attack. One of the soldiers was caught in the monster's grasp, his face twisted in pain. He screamed for help, calling out for Gordon to save him. Another soldier desperately swung his axe, trying to cut the vines that held his friend captive. He put all his strength into each swing, hoping to break the monster's grip. The soldier stared in disbelief as his axe bounced off the vines without making a dent. He was shocked that they wouldn't break, wondering why they were so strong. The soldier was yanked off his feet, falling towards the monster's gaping maw. He screamed Gordon's name as he fell, hoping for a miracle. Ghislaine faced the Dirus Ent, his eyes narrowed with determination. He raised his sword, the blade glowing with a blue light, ready to strike down the monstrous tree. Ghislaine swung his sword with incredible force, hitting the Dirus Ent head on. The impact sent splinters flying as the monster roared in pain. Ghislaine didn't stop there. He spun around and prepared for another strike, his movements quick and precise. He was determined to take down the monster. The soldiers watched in fear as the monster stood tall, unfazed by the attacks. But one of them noticed something and shouted that they should try to shut it down, thinking their eyes might be their weakness. Ghislaine looked absolutely furious, his face contorted in anger. He yelled at the soldiers to get themselves together, trying to snap them out of their fear. Ghislaine ordered the soldiers not to spread out, warning that they would be easier targets. He told them to raise their shields and form a tight formation so they wouldn't get caught by the vines. Ghislaine commanded them to focus on defense until they received their next order. The soldiers responded immediately, yelling. One of the soldiers yelled for everyone to block all directions, determined not to die there. He then asked Kayor if the oil lamps were ready. Kayor confirmed that they were all there. Ghislaine ordered them to light the lamps and throw them at the monsters, telling them to burn them down. Another soldier realized that was why they had brought so many lamps. One of the soldiers yelled in alarm, warning that the monsters were looking their way. The red eyes of the Dirus Ents glowed menacingly in the distance. Ghislaine yelled for the soldiers to throw the lamps, hoping to burn the monsters. The soldiers obeyed and hurled the lamps at the approaching Dirus Ents, ready to give those monsters a taste of fire. The monsters swatted the lamps away like flies, crushing them before they could do any real damage. One of the soldiers realized with dismay that their plan to burn the monsters down wasn't going to work. The monsters were on them in an instant, their massive limbs swinging like clubs. One of the soldiers was sent flying into the air after being hit by a Dirus Ent, a grunt escaping his lips. Belinda readied herself to throw more lamps, her expression determined. Nearby, Jillian also prepared to hurl the lamps, ready to do whatever it took to protect the mercenaries. Ghislaine yelled for Jillian and Belinda to get ready to throw the lamps while guarding the Cerberus mercenaries. He knew they had to change tactics if they wanted to survive this. Belinda yelled that she would draw their attention, warning the young master to watch out. Above her, the monster loomed, its massive form casting a shadow over the battlefield. Ghislaine didn't hesitate. He charged straight at the Dirus Ent, his sword crackling with blue energy as he swung it with all his might. Ghislaine slashed at the monster again and again, but the Dirus Ent barely seemed to notice. The monster's eye glowed with a menacing red light, and Ghislaine felt a chill run down his spine. One of the soldiers shouted in disbelief, realizing that the monsters had legs. He was shocked that they weren't just trees, and worried that the other soldiers were going to get stomped on at this rate. Ghislaine kept attacking, his sword a blur of motion as he tried to find a weak spot. The Dirus Ent swatted at him with its massive branches, forcing him to dodge and weave to avoid getting crushed. Ghislaine kept slashing at the Dirus Ent, his sword glowing with a bright blue energy. Each strike was meant to find a weak spot, but the monster didn't seem to care. The soldiers realized the Dirus Ent was heading for their employer. They knew they had to do something, even if it meant risking their lives. Belinda yelled at the soldiers to throw all the oil lamps, hoping it would work this time. She was counting on the fire to weaken the monster. The soldiers threw the lamps with all their strength, sending them flying towards the Dirus Ent. The lamps smashed against the monster, and the area was instantly covered in flames. The mercenaries grinned, seeing the Dirus Ent engulfed in flames. It looked like their plan was actually working. Ghislaine yelled at the soldiers to keep throwing the lamps and not to stop. He looked absolutely furious, his eyes burning with determination. The flames engulfed the Dirus Ents, turning them into blazing infernos. The forest was filled with the sounds of their burning bodies. One of the soldiers was amazed that they were actually fighting back against the monsters, but then he wondered if the entire forest was going to burn down because of it. One of the soldiers said that the monsters were nothing and that they were weak against fire since they were just trees. Ghislaine warned them not to let their guard down because it wasn't over yet. He seemed disturbed by something. Ghislaine stared ahead with a serious look on his face. He announced that the monsters would now show their true appearances, which made the soldiers nervous. The smoke and steam billowed around the forest, obscuring everything. The soldiers looked up, trying to figure out what was happening. One of the soldiers wondered what the smoke was. Another asked if it was steam, and if the fire had been put out. The young master and young lord were confused about what was happening. The young master explained that the monsters were weak against fire on the outside, but not on the inside. The young master went on to explain that the fire was burning the shells of the monsters, but when it hit the wet flesh inside, it caused them to release steam. Inside the monsters, the fire met the moisture, creating a thick, scalding steam. The monsters writhed in pain from the inside out. The soldiers stared up in disbelief. They thought the monsters were defeated, but they were still moving. One of them shouted, wondering what those things were and how they could still be alive. A soldier called for everyone's attention. The mercenaries raised their weapons, ready for what was coming. Ghislaine raised his sword high above his head, the steel glinting in the dim light of the forest. He prepared to give the order. Ghislaine declared that from now on, they would be fighting up close. He knew that they had to change their strategy. Ghislaine screamed for them to charge. He took off running, his sword held high, ready to strike. Ghislaine stood before the troops, his sword raised, ready to face the giant monsters. The soldiers stared up at the monstrous figures, looming over them, their faces a mix of fear and determination. The tension was thick in the air as they awaited their leader's command. The mercenaries prepared to charge, steeling themselves for the fight. One of them voiced his concern about fighting the massive monsters up close, but the others were eager to get into the action. They had been waiting for this for a long time. One of the men shouted, warning young Master Ghislaine to be careful. Another yelled at the others, demanding to know what they were waiting for. They needed to move, and fast. Gillian declared that this was an order from young Lord Ghislaine, and they should trust him. In the background, Ghislaine was already engaged in battle, his sword flashing against the monster's hide. The soldier stared ahead, his expression a mix of shock and disbelief. He didn't know what to think. The mercenaries charged forward, weapons raised, ready to follow the plan. One of them shouted that he believed the employer would do something about it, and they should trust him and follow his orders. Ghislaine encouraged his troops to fight without fear, promising to burn away anything they couldn't dodge. He declared the monsters were nothing but huge target dummies, and ordered them to annihilate them. Ghislaine continued his assault, his movements swift and deadly. He knew that hesitation meant death in this fight, and he wouldn't allow his men to falter. Ghislaine declared that his role was to eradicate all hesitation from his followers. He stood tall, his glowing sword a beacon of resolve. Ghislaine pressed his attack, his sword flashing as he struck the monster with precision. The air crackled with energy as he continued his relentless assault. Ghislaine stood over the fallen monsters, his sword raised high. He was determined to instill in his men the will to make the impossible possible, no matter the odds. The soldiers looked around in disbelief, sweat dripping from their brows. One of them stammered, barely able to believe they had actually killed all of those monsters. Ghislaine turned to the soldiers and ordered them to line up. His expression was stern, already focused on the next challenge ahead. Ghislaine explained that this was the forest of beasts. He warned them that they were only at the entrance, yet it was already swarming with monsters like the direst ents. Ghislaine reassured them not to worry. He promised he would always be standing at the forefront, ready to face whatever came next. Ghislaine looked determined as he gave the order for everyone to trust him and follow after him. His blue eyes were intense, focused on the path ahead. The soldiers responded as one, their voices echoing in the forest. They agreed to follow Ghislaine's lead, trusting in his command. The battle continued, a brutal clash of steel and claw. All around them, the soldiers fought desperately against the monstrous creatures, each strike a struggle for survival. A monstrous creature lunged forward, its jaws wide open, ready to tear into the soldiers. The air was thick with the stench of blood and the roar of battle. One of the soldiers yelled in frustration, barely able to believe what he was seeing. He couldn't believe how many monsters there were. It seemed like they would never end. One of the soldiers shouted, seeing the monster's legs falling right towards them. It was about to crush them all. The monster crashed to the ground, defeated. A sword pierced through its body, ensuring it wouldn't get back up. Ghislaine checked to see if anyone was hurt. The soldiers responded that they were alive, barely believing it themselves. They knew that sticking close to Ghislaine was the only way they'd make it out of this mess alive. They yelled at the monsters to come at them, their formation looking better than before. The best way to train was through combat, after all. Ghislaine told them that they still had a ways to go and to keep clearing the path. The soldiers responded, agreeing to keep pushing forward. One of the soldiers looked completely out of it, his eyes wide with shock. He thought that everyone had gone insane, just a bunch of crazy scumbags stuck in this crazy forest. The forest finally opened up, revealing a coastline. It was a welcome sight after the constant fighting. The group walked towards the beach, the sound of the waves crashing against the shore, filling the air. One of the soldiers ran towards the water, exclaiming how clean it looked and how thirsty he was. Another soldier immediately warned him, saying that they didn't know what might come out of the lake. Ghislaine stated that they had taken the right path so far and that the lake was the most important milestone in reaching the runestone mine. He then ordered the soldiers to set up camp by the lake. The soldiers started setting up camp, pitching tents and starting fires. The area was soon filled with the sounds of hammering and chatter. One of the soldiers grumbled, wondering what they were even doing, and complaining that they still weren't far from the entrance. He couldn't even imagine what was waiting further ahead. He was thankful that nothing had happened the last 2 nights, but he was still on edge. The group gathered around the campfire, the flames casting long shadows. One of the men looked at Manus, clearly agitated. He wanted to know if Manus was really suggesting they sneak out of the forest, and he demanded to know what Manus was even talking about. Manus leaned forward, his expression serious. He argued that their lives were worth more than any amount of money, and that they shouldn't risk them any further. He reminded them that their employer had said the destination wasn't far, but he questioned whether they could trust those words. The man looked up, his voice filled with suspicion. He accused their employer of being a scoundrel, suggesting that he had ulterior motives for wanting to explore the forest. He believed their employer was trying to accomplish something for himself. Another man countered, reminding everyone that they had already been paid and that it was their job to follow the employer's orders. He also pointed out that the employer had saved their lives on several occasions. He admitted that their employer was a good fighter, but he feared that luck would run out eventually, and one mistake would cost them everything. The man leaned in, his face etched with worry. He was convinced that the employer would use them as meat shields if things got tough, claiming that all nobles were the same. He paused, admitting that the other man had a point, but his fear remained. The hooded man grinned, pleased that his scheme was working. He thought they were scared now, and he knew they'd be suicidal to go back there alone with all those monsters. He even admitted to himself that he'd use them as bait if he needed to. Then, he told everyone to take a look over there. Someone carefully applied ointment to a wound on their arm. The gesture was small, but it spoke volumes about the need for healing and care in this dangerous place. The man applying the ointment told the other to make sure water didn't get into the wound, or it would get infected. The injured guy thanked him, but the first man wondered if he knew how expensive the medicines were. He suggested he use them on himself, pointing out that this was what the medicine was for. The man spoke up, declaring that the medicines and potions the employer was using on them were more expensive than they were. He questioned whether the employer would really do that if he was just planning to use them as meat shields. Another man agreed, stating that their employer was different from the others and that he didn't think he'd abandon them. Meanwhile, the hooded man cursed Gillian for hindering him. He knew he had to persuade at least a few of them to leave, but it was proving difficult. Young Lord Ghislaine ordered everyone to stop chatting and get some rest while they could. The soldiers immediately responded, acknowledging his command. Young Lord Ghislaine pulled Gillian and Kaor aside, telling them there was something they needed to talk about. Gillian acknowledged, but then wondered if Ghislaine was sure he wanted to leave the hooded man alone. He thought that if he were Ghislaine, he would have ripped his tongue off. Ghislaine assured him that he was sure, explaining that the hooded man wouldn't be able to do anything for a while anyway. He added that there was something more important that he needed to confirm right now. Ghislaine asked why he wanted them to count the number of lamps out here. One of them replied that there were currently about 24. Ghislaine explained that, as expected, they were missing a few. He pointed out that monsters had rushed at them day and night ever since they entered the forest. However, they hadn't seen any of them for the past 2 nights. That meant something. Gillian explained that they'd entered the territory of a nocturnal monster, one with a huge influence on the forest. Ghislaine confirmed that he was correct. The forest was quiet, too quiet. The air hung heavy with a sense of foreboding. Ghislaine stood there, a chill running down his spine despite himself. Ghislaine stared ahead, his expression hardening. He realized that the real danger was only just beginning. He had a bad feeling about what was coming.